guys for coming back for day two. We're really excited. We think we've got a great program full of some tremendous opportunities today. I'm going to introduce our key speakers here again, Chief Grayson and Chief Powell from the Salem Fire Department, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Hopefully this is the last time I walk back up here. Oh, maybe not. I have props.
Anybody here new that wasn't here yesterday? Okay.
Awesome.
Couple. Good.
This is like a meeting. Introduce yourself, say where you're from, why you're here. Make sure you're not in the wrong room.
I'm Charmaine from Tualatin Valley Fire and Rescue. I'm in the EMS division and I'm here to learn about your program.
Awesome. We're here to learn from you. Sir?
Tim Pope, I work for Salem Fire. I'm here to learn.
Awesome. Nobody else had to introduce themselves yesterday, so thank you for doing that. So if it's okay with everybody, I'm loud. We will be walking around on the floor to talk to you if that's all right. Not standing up there. We don't do that very well. But once again, my name is Sean Grayson. I'm the fire chief in the city of Rialto. We are happy to be here with you, sharing and learning about sudden cardiac arrest survival. We'll kick off the morning with a little bit of introductions, a little bit of science, probably a lot of science, but we say a little bit just so you don't leave right now. And we'll get into kind of the meat of the how. Like we said yesterday, everybody does CPR. It's not so much the what, it's the how you do it. And then in the afternoon, we'll get into all hands-on activities. So I was born once, I grew up, and that's probably all you need to know about me, other than I'm here to listen, learn, and share what we've found out along the way. And this is Joe, and he can introduce himself.
So I'm Joe. I run the EMS division for Rialto Fire. I was also born once, right? So it's just a real formal environment here. So as we run through some of these slides and some of these things and we say some stuff, don't hesitate to go, hey, wait a minute. First off, that's crap, right? Or I don't believe you, or that doesn't make any sense, or tell me more about that. Either way.
We are being recorded.
I didn't use a bad word.
You have a maximum cuss word allowance.
All right.
And then behind us, Jeremiah, if you want to stand up. From yesterday, for the two of you that didn't meet him before, Jeremiah, you can introduce yourself.
So I'm Jeremiah Mendoza. I work for Salem Fire. I've been there about 6 years. I'm an engineer and a paramedic. Spent a few years on the ambulance there, so a lot of stuff you guys will be doing. I've done, I don't even know how many times, so if you got questions about really the practicality of it, ask me about it. I'll tell you the good, the bad, the tips and tricks for when something breaks, something doesn't work. I probably broke everything and done everything wrong, so I know how to fix it.
A couple of years on our ambulance downtown is like a decade in most places.
The hurt box.
He's probably turning 6,500 calls a year or something like that for most of the time. So that's us. We would like to find out a little bit more about you. You don't all have to stand up, but I appreciate the folks from Salem and Tualatin being willing to do that. But how many from Oregon? How many from Washington? How many from California? Jeremiah raised his hand. And from Sacramento, California. Any other places? Any other states? Canada? Germany?
New England?
New England?
You guys think it is if you're from England.
Yeah, Massachusetts isn't a state either. It's a commonwealth. Oh.
So there.
I'm on the West Coast, I can say that, and they're not armed. So, how many of you are mechanical CPR users? What is it that you use? Lucas? Autopulse? Any other defib techs, Michigan Instruments? You still have an old thumper that uses oxygen bottles? No? Okay. How many of you have heart monitors that have feedback? And what monitors are you using? Zoll what? X-Series? Anybody else different? Philips MRX with feedback? Okay.
We do, but we just don't use it.
We do, but we don't use it. So you use
Physio.
LifePak 15, but without feedback.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a funny process in EMS, right? We have a lot of equipment that we could use, but we don't. We have it. I don't know what that deal is, but kind of a process.
Somebody, I think it was the fall folks, were sharing with us that they buy a lot of Ferraris and they use the glove compartment. Was that you guys yesterday? That's it. So they got really cool tool, and the same thing's true with any heart monitor, right? That's probably, I don't know, it's a lot of money. It's not cheap, and you probably don't use all the pieces and parts of it. How many of you are using a rescue pod, impedance threshold device? Gig Harbor. All right. How many of you use intubation as your primary airway for cardiac arrest? How many of you use a supraglottic airway as your primary airway? What supraglottic airway are you using? King, combi tube?
King?
iGel. All right, so we will talk today, not in depth, but there's some emergent science so we want neurologically intact survivors. Would you give me that? We don't want to just get heartbeats back. And the King and the combi tube are by far the most impactful on raising intracranial pressure, which has a direct correlation to decrease in cerebral perfusion pressures, which has a direct correlation to non-neurologically intact survival if you get the heartbeat back. The iGel, on the other hand, Doc, is the least impactful, so good choice, thank you. We use the King tube. So we say, airway-wise, BLS to intubation. If intubation doesn't work, back to BLS, and if that doesn't work, cut a hole in their neck. Can't use the King tube, because you kill them anyway. So that's just some of the stuff we'll talk about today. That has nothing to do with the King tube being bad. It's just we didn't know when we bought it that its impact on intracranial pressure would be so profound in cardiac arrest.
We spend a fair amount of dollars on the King tube that sit in our shelves, and our guys know they're not allowed to use them. Right? Use a King tube, you're gonna be talking to me in my office, right?
So for some of you, that probably made you mad, and we'll have more opportunities to make you mad throughout the rest of the day. Any other airway preferences? Anybody doing no ventilations in CPR until an advanced airway? CCR. Okay. Do you just put an on-rebreather on them? Yeah? On-rebreather for 6 minutes? Have you ever heard of the word atelectasis? Yes. Okay. There's lots of different variations out there in a variety of things, and so none of them, we're not saying any of them are wrong, and today we're not going to tell you that anything you're doing is wrong. We're going to share with you the things that we did wrong for a very long time and the things that we've done to improve them. I say this all the time, what we do is not perfect, it's not even close. At least half of what we're doing is wrong, and the other half is not optimized, but it's significantly better than what it was before. So the improvements are dramatic, and I would much rather take bringing home more people alive every year than not. Please don't take this as, this is some, off-the-shelf kit that you can buy and we're saying it's perfect, because it's not, and it's not for sale, it's free. Joe's much smarter than me, but I'm not smart enough to make something that I could sell, so I come to you for free and say, if you'd like to, you can have this stuff, and all we ask is, if you do it, tell us what you did and what ways we can make our program better.
So I need your data, right? So we're a relatively small sample size. We have 120, 130 cardiac arrests. We work up about 90 of them a year. And so if you're gonna steal what we're doing, I just want your data. I want to know what's working for you and not working for you, so we can have a bigger sample size and a bigger sample size, all right? And so we can learn, because there's things, like the chief says, there's things we're doing that are wrong, but we don't know it yet. And I need a bigger sample size to know that. So I'm gonna ask for your data at some point.
So all but 2 of you were with us yesterday, so we'll run this. Normally we would do as a quiz, and it's meant to make you think. Another way to say that is to embarrass you or to make you mad. But most of you are going to know the answer, so we'll do it a little different today. But there'll be less than 2 minutes. So that rhythm in your system is what? Still asystole. It doesn't change when you cross the organ border, right? And survival in your system from asystole, probably more like that, right? But we talked about yesterday that there's some assumptions built into that, and in our system, 39% ROSC in that rhythm. So that's ROSC, that's not neurologically intact survival. Cut that in half, 20% neurologically intact survival from that rhythm. So it's a difference, right? How about that rhythm?
What is that? What do you do with it? What do we do with it?
Shock and noise system, yeah.
Excellent. So we do this, right? This is what we do with BFib, right? How else can you get them out of BFib?
Anybody
shock 'em out of
recognize
BFib?
the monitor there? It's a Life Pack 9.
So yeah, for those of you that are under like 20 years old, those are called paddles, right? We used to put them on the chest and defibrillate like that. But not in Rialto, right? Not always in Rialto. We don't always defibrillate.
Sometimes maybe. What's that, Joe?
CPR on a flat, hard surface with your hands. That's how we do CPR. How else are you going to do it? Stand them up.
I like
Put them up against the wall. It's not how we do it in Rialto. Epinephrine, what do we give it for? Cardiac arrest, right? Cardiac arrest. So this is the drug of choice. Drugs save lives, paramedics save lives. We do cool things, we give drugs. So the only way you can really look cool in front of the chicks is if you flip the lids up high and throw them together, squirt some fluid out, right?
Dr. Lofel showed you Johnny and Roy yesterday, that scene from Emergency. And they always did that, right?
I'm
Those
sorry, the
caps
chicks are the guys.
Those
I'm
caps
sorry.
are only there for that reason. There's no other, value. Can you think of any other medications where you have those caps to flip off? No.
They make you look cool.
We do give it though, right, Joe?
Eventually, on the correct patient in the correct environment.
I think I have to walk up there to click this.
It should play by itself.
There are incredible organizations all throughout the country. Okay, that's not gonna work. Can you guys hear it when it plays? There are incredible organizations all throughout the country who are doing wonderful things with Unsteam, and I applaud them for that, and we will take as much of their knowledge base as possible and plug into our program. My biggest problem with Unsteam, not a problem with Unsteam, but in trying to provide services in the city of Rialto is that it's such a small percentage of our cardiac arrest units. And just like we don't want to discriminate based on where you live, what you do for a living, or any other aspect, I don't want to discriminate based on what rhythm you're in. So if we wanted to be known for something and we don't, we just want to do our job, be our mission, take care of the city. But if we want to be known for something, it would be finding ways to translate what we can, those high success rates that we can have with Unseen into a rhythm neutral approach. Nothing beats high quality CPR, and we really do mean nothing. We won't stop it to innovate. We won't stop it to start an IV. We won't stop it to check a rhythm. We won't stop it. We won't even stop it if we think it might be ROSC, because even if the heart just started beating, there's no endogenous perfusion pressure at that point. So we might as well let the heart pulse do its job and build that up so that when we do turn it off, it doesn't revert back to its underlying rhythm. It is my job absolutely to champion the cause of both our fire and EMS folks. We really do, as we spoke about earlier, our goal simply is neurologically intact survival from sudden cardiac arrest. There's no percentage, there's no value, there's no anything else. It doesn't matter which part of town you live in, how much money you can. We're just about investing our efforts in that process and making that happen.
Yeah, going back, I've been in EMS for 8 years, and I had 2 cardiac saves prior to working here, and in the last 22 months, I've had 16.
With all my heart, every bone in my body. Thank you. And I appreciate them, and I honor what they do.
You guys have videos like that? Make them, share them with your council. We didn't either. Somebody graciously helped us out with that, but it's impactful. Any part of that mean more to you than any other part? Anything you hear in there valuable? 16 saves in 22 months. I didn't have 16 saves in 22 years. Joe?
No, not even close.
So, but that's the goal. That's what we're trying to do.
So the change in our department is we were like everybody else. We had 10% ROSC, right? And everybody ran full cardiac arrest, and Jeremiah can tell you this. And you're going to run the call. You're going to push a couple rounds. You're going to call them or take them to the hospital, and they're going to call them. You're going to be back at the station in 30 minutes, and that's the way it goes, right? So now, in our department, those guys go on a cardiac arrest. They do their thing, and if they don't get ROSC, they come into my office and go, "Hey, dude, That's my name, dude, right? So, hey, you know, we had this guy and his end-tidal CO2 was great and we did heads up and we did rescue pod and we did all this cool stuff and we thought he had a great chance, but he didn't make it. I'm sorry. You see the difference there? They're sorry when they don't get, they're like, hey, I'm sorry, we didn't get ROSC, I don't understand. Whereas before it was just every day you didn't get ROSC, right? That's just the way it worked. It's completely changed in the way our department looks at things now.
And they have to send us emails, after action review emails from critical calls like this. And sometimes they put that in there. Jeremiah, would you say, what do you expect when you run a code?
Obviously it depends on a lot of things, you know, in title, but if everything's moving good, in title good, you know, relatively short downtime, it's kind of changed to where you're honestly more surprised when you don't get wrong. So it's definitely different than before. You got it, you're, you know, dumped out. Oh, we got pulses back.
Now what do we do?
Now it's very complex to the point where if everything's looking good, it doesn't make sense why you don't get it.
All right, so, is that right? We can go back one, Chief?
Whose fault is it?
So 10% ROSC, right? That's kind of the national standard, somewhere around there, right? That's when you combine everybody that reports some level of data. Obviously, people that report some level of data have usually a higher cardiac arrest save rate than the people that don't. But 10%. 10% is acceptable, right? All my career, 10% was acceptable. But it's not. So whose fault is it and why is that acceptable? Is it the tube's fault? Or we love to blame the tube. We talked about this yesterday, right? We blame the device. It's probably not the tube's fault. What is this thing here? A BVM? It must be the BVM's fault, right? Yeah, probably not. It might be the guy behind the BVM's fault. We'll discuss that a little bit, but it's not the BVM's fault.
How much air is in that BVM? A lot? More than you would need? Yeah. So you're sitting here right now, you're alive, you're not breathing that much, and how fast are you breathing right now? 10 times a minute? But we'll give somebody that's dead that needs very little oxygen, that full bag, 40 times a minute. I don't think it's the bag's fault either. You saw the slide yesterday.
Yeah. So we got to be questioning everything we do, and we got to be questioning everything we do that has bad outcomes, right? If it has a bad outcome and we continue to do it, and that's just the way we do it because that's how we've always done it, it's not acceptable. Got to question that.
So we talked about yesterday that, you know, in the innovation cycle, one of the tenets of innovation is that you stop benchmarking, you stop looking at what the best and the brightest in the industry do, because 10% is not the best of the best, is the cream of the crop, right? I'm not blaming anybody for that. That's what everybody does. That's just not a good enough number, right? So they say reverse benchmark instead. You look at what everyone's doing and you say, let's not do that. Let's do something different. So, you know, if you learn anything here today, and I hope you do, we would respectfully suggest that you assess what you do critically. You look at the things differently when you leave today than you did before. I don't know if you're an Oregon State fan or if you're an Oregon fan. There's some probably Washington or Washington State fans in the room. This guy does not get paid for his job, I don't think. He doesn't play for USC, so he probably doesn't get paid for his job. But if he only was successful 1 out of 10 times, he would not be playing, right? So, because the expectation is that he be much better than that. What is the expectation in your community of what you do? Do they expect, does your mission statement say we strive for mediocrity? Does it say we aim to try? I'm guessing you have something that says something like excellence, right? Is 10% excellence? I mean, it would be if that's the best that's humanly possible, but respectfully, we suggest that 10% is not. And many of you in the room have much higher survival rates than 10%, don't get me wrong. But, you know.
This guy's kicking a football. This guy gets fired if he misses the next 3 field goals, but we're saving lives and we're okay with it.
So this is what we got taught from the men and women that work for us, is to unlearn what we had learned. Joe and I did it wrong for
Ever.
And we did a lot of things with airway, esophageal obturator airways, those were awesome. We gave a lot of meds that made no difference. In fact, they probably hurt people. Levofed would be a good example. While we were doing that, and some of those meds we put down the tube, which was awesome. You know, and while we're getting that tube and giving those meds, and while we're doing those things, what were we not doing? Compressions, right? We were always told you got to do compressions, but that was the what. The how was never about keeping your hands on chest. The other thing we learned is that even when we do keep our hands on chest, how good are we at CPR? How good is the human animal at doing appropriate rate, depth, and full recoil of CPR? Horrible. So
which path do you want to go down, right? It's kind of a choose your path. You can go down the 10% path, or you can kind of join us on the 60% path. So that's our ROS grade across all rhythms, witnessed, unwitnessed, VFib, all rhythms, all cases. That's all comers except for people that we call on scene, obviously, that have regular lividity. But
So 6 out of 10 get pulses back. Not all of them live. You saw that yesterday, Joe's. I believe in that statement. I tend to be a little bit more politically correct.
he's nicer
right?
than I am.
Yeah. Ignorance is not a bad thing, right? I'm ignorant about a lot of things. But one thing that we hope and we talk about these things is that you empower your people to do better for your community, and one of the ways to do that is to challenge institutional knowledge, challenge the things that everyone knows is not great, but they're willing to accept it because it's the way we do things. Have any of you ever said it is what it is? Have you ever heard your employee say it is what it is? And the younger you are, the more likely you are to answer yes to that. Neuro-linguistically, do you know what that means? What is your brain trying to say? That is an emotion. It's coming from a part of your brain that doesn't have language. For real. It's a mammalian part of your brain. It's a little bit lower. But you're going to get it out there. What you're really trying to say in most cases is it's not the way it should be. That is the translation, right? So today, my guess is 10%, or whatever your survival rate is today, you say it is what it is. We would respectfully suggest you use the actual language that your brain's trying to put out there, which is it's not the way it should be. So cardiac arrest failures, this is us. This is what we learned looking back at retrospective data. Too much time off the chest, and by too much time I mean way too much time off the chest. The ROC Prime Med trials that Dr. Lauerfeld spoke about yesterday, the retrospective analysis of that study said that high quality CPR was 50% compliance with rate and depth. Didn't talk about recoil at all. 50%. So you could be at 100 compressions a minute half of the time. Or you could be 2 to 2.4 inches, which is stupid, by the way, because I don't measure in point something of inches, but I also don't measure. There's no stop on most humans, right? So you don't know when you got to 2.4. So we're really, really bad at that. Too much reliance on ALS before BLS. We have paramedics on everything. That must be awesome, right? But is it? Not if paramedics are trying to do something which is contrary to the best thing for the patient. So if they stop CPR to drill a hole in their leg, they stop CPR to give them a medication, they stop CPR to intubate them. Not training the public in hands-only CPR. How many of you train 10% of your population a year in hands-only CPR? Every year, 10%? That's awesome. So that is an estimated from NIH number needed to treat, essentially, for how many people you need to train in hands-only CPR to have an increase in what your current bystander CPR rate is. I serve a city of 120,000 people, so I need train 12,000 people a year, right? So fortunately, I can do that just by hitting every high school senior, every 8th grader, and going to every homecoming game and every grand opening of whatever restaurant it is that is willing to put an AED in their restaurant and give away a free cup of coffee If you come and do hands-only CPR on the sidewalk, learn how to use an AED and download the Pulse Point app. But that's a tremendous challenge that we were not meeting. Overventilation, you heard me say that yesterday. Bag too much. People call me crazy when I say it's 40. If you ever stand back and watch any of your arrests, especially any of your old arrests, that number is not surprising. Or, I'll give you another one, no offense, Doc. I don't know if you're an ER doc, but if you watch an arrest in an ER, if you watch an arrest in the ER, you will commonly find one of two things with ventilation. More like 40 to 50 times a minute, or more like 0 to 2 times a minute. Either somebody's not doing it at all, or somebody is just, so your question.
And no compression analysis.
Correct.
You're not looking at this, you're not doing heads-up CPR. So what happens when you get, everything that you're doing is on the front end, right? That's one piece, you get the bystander, you got what you do, and then you have everything that happens afterwards. So I don't know if this is the appropriate time to ask this, but what happens in the ER, maybe Jeremiah, you can answer this, and then what happens following to get your neurologic outcomes?
It used
When
to.
you arrive in my emergency department, oftentimes it's a shit show, right?
Yeah, you're not on tape, it's okay. I agree. So everywhere we go, this is the respectful way to say it, is what is the cardiac arrest survival rate in hospital in your emergency room? I guarantee you don't publish it. You don't put it up anywhere. You don't put it on the wall like Salem Fire puts it on the wall in the training center, right? And even if you did, the number will be nowhere near what is done in the field today. But where we started, Jeremiah, correct me if I'm wrong, we would take them to a hospital when we started, and they would rip off the auto pulse and the ITD and take it all off, right? We are not there today. They train all of the residents, all of the attending. Jeremiah, they just promoted a resident to attending, right? And he's awesome. He uses all of our crap, right?
Yeah, so
Takes time.
the one we go to most of the time is pretty good about keeping them on Galafols. We've got a pretty good relationship with that hospital. All of their residents come and ride out with us. They learn about what we do cardiac survivability wise. There's a couple that just finished residency and became attendants, so they're very good about trying to implement anything new. So they're delaying FE, they leave them on the auto. But other hospitals, we had one the other night, took them in. First thing they did was take the auto pulse off, check a pulse, do a little bit of manual CPR and call for the 2 minutes. For sure.
Because the difference between those two, you got an academic facility, your residents are, and you have a community facility.
Yeah.
That the survival rate is better than academic.
Yeah,
So one-
it's training.
Part of this whole thing is like, where do you take your continuum into the ER? Obviously,
We try not to transport non-ROS patients.
And so one of
That's
the things
simple.
that we've done is we've moved to a 30-minute on-scene minimum, right? So, and I haven't told anybody this in the field, but I'm guessing that number is going to go up from 30 minutes to more like 45, but because,
but eventually they have to go to
Yeah.
the hospital, and I'm not trying to dwell on this, but
You-
that's where a lot
You
of.
have to engage your hospital folks. You have to engage your emergency room. You have to engage your cath lab, because the future, all post-cardiac arrest patients should go to the cath lab. If they are a STEMI in the ROSC environment, they should immediately go to the cath lab. That's not Chief Grayson saying that. That's AHA saying that. If they're a non-STEMI, 4 hours they should be in the cath lab.
Sure, but the problem with that is that Medicare publishes numbers for each individual cardiologist in the facility itself.
Yep.
And if they
Yeah.
take a bunch of sick people to the lab and they don't do well, then it reflects on.
yeah, their death rate goes up, death on the table.
They're unmotivated to do that.
So you have to engage those folks, because there's a difference between routine catheterization and a rescue cath. It counts differently in JACO, it counts differently in billing, but that's where you need doctors and nurses in the in-hospital environment to start that discussion. I know you won't get there today, right?
I've been
But
working on it for years and it's not going well.
And it's not going great for us either. We're working on it, right? We're working on getting those patients to cath lab. We're not there, and I don't know anybody that is. You guys know anybody that's actually there outside of in the U.S.?
A letter saying there's a difference between a rescue cath and a regular cath, a therapeutic cath, and then this should not reflect poorly on the cardiologist number. And that got shot completely down for a variety of reasons. So, I mean, ECMO is what I think is going to be the saving grace. And that you mentioned that one of your facilities, probably not academic facilities, moving in that direction.
Yeah, Arrowhead already has it for trauma services, and they're moving to it for cardiac services, absolutely. So, and we could talk about that all day, and I appreciate that, but that is a huge component. If you're not engaging your hospital partners, then you're definitely leaving some patients on the table. And how many of you have ever taken a patient to the hospital with pulses, and the ER doc is already talking to the family about a DNR or about, you know what? Yeah? Okay. So neuroprognostication within the first 72 hours is make-believe. If they don't herniate their brainstem or they don't have undifferentiated gray-white matter, there is no way to tell if they're going to survive. Flat EEG means nothing. Cardiac arrhythmias mean nothing. The age of the patient, how long they were down, none of that means anything. So, but it's pretty common.
So one more point on ventilation. So how fast do you ventilate a patient that's not breathing? What's AHA say? 10 to 12 times a minute, right? And that AHA standard, you got to ventilate them 10 to 12 times a minute. And so any idea how fast my guys ventilate or told to ventilate in the field? Patient not breathing? Yeah, I don't care. I don't care. I do not care how fast you squeeze the damn bag or how hard you squeeze the bag. I don't care. Keep their sats in a normal range, keep their end-tidal CO2 between 35 and 45, and I don't care.
When he said DAM, he meant DAM, you know, the retention of
That was better
water
than the
with an
word I was
overflow or
going
underflow. He didn't mean a bad word. So,
right? So why do we treat a patient based on a number in a book, but we don't treat the patient based on their actual signs, right? What's actually working for them? Are they satting okay? Is there any time the CO2 where you want it? Are you over-bagging them? Are you under-bagging them? Right? That's how you should be bagging a patient. Not 10 to 12 times a minute. And 10 to 12 times a minute isn't 10 to 12 times a minute like Chief Grayson said, right? It's 40.
by the way, it's easy. If your end-tidal CO2 goes down when you bag them, you're bagging them too often. That's it.
Stop bagging
Just take out, if you just waited 6 seconds, now wait 12. If you bag them again, their end-tidal CO2 goes down. You bagged them too close to the previous ventilation. It's not rocket science.
Culturally, I'm sorry. There's a question back there too, but.
You talked yesterday about end-tidal CO2s being too high. When those end-tidal CO2s are high, train guys to bag to the end-tidal CO2. They're not hyperventilating that patient at that point.
No, then they're just back to regular rate, yeah.
So you don't want it to necessarily always bag for that.
We're talking about in the hypo perfusion state when they're below normal. Yep. So.
But those are some outliers that we're trying to figure out what to do with, right? So, yeah. Do you have a question?
Are you guys using ventilators in the field at all?
We aren't. There's some pretty cool ones out there, though. So there's a brand new one on the market, which he'll probably make me buy at some point, which means I got to go find some money. You know, there's also there's the old Autovent, and there's some other, you know, things that some people use. We would argue that that is far superior, right? And so before I digress, let me say this. If you were going to go to the OR and have surgery, and you met with the anesthesiologist first, and he said, okay, it's going to be a complicated 12-hour surgery, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to throw OPA in your mouth. I'm just going to bag you whenever I feel like it for 12 hours. Would you be okay with that? No. You'd want at least an LMA or something, and you'd want to be on a ventilator, because it will be perfect every time, right? God forbid you have cancer and you're going to go in for chemo, right? Where not enough won't kill the cancer and too much will kill you. You want the old school paramedic that went to nursing school late in their career, going to the board with the dry erase and like doing some math and be like, screw it, just wide open until you get a result, right? No, right? But we're okay with that in the pre-hospital arena for ventilations and compressions. There are devices that do it perfect every time, and we're like, nah, we don't want that. Human hands, which are demonstrably worse, we'll take those. So, speaking of demonstrably worse, who's that, Joe?
Who's this guy? Ocho Cinco, right? A little football reference. There's a couple of football references here, huh? And then you see Chad, right? Chad Ocho Cinco, right? Yeah. He's doing some compressions for us. He's doing some manual compressions, but it's just can't get it. I didn't get the football back.
That's the ER, right, Doc?
So.
And call.
So here's my question for you, and this might not make you 100% happy, but what do high quality manual compressions or manual compressions and this guy have in common? Yeah, I'm sorry. Neither one of them exist. And I can prove it to you, and you guys have all proved it to us, right? So with data, I've never seen it. never seen high quality manual compressions over a period of time. So, next year. This is an NIH PrimeMed trial. And in this trial, they looked at 8,719 patients. Acceptable quality CPR in this trial was a compression fraction of over 50%. Now realize when we talk compression fraction, I'm talking about one aspect of compressions. I'm only talking rate, right? I'm not talking depth and I'm not talking recoil. But in this study, any compression fraction over 50% is considered high quality.
Plus
So
or minus
if you
20%, by the way.
What's that?
Plus or minus 20%, so you could have been 50% compliant with an 80 a minute rate. My math says that you could have done 40 compressions a minute and been high quality CPR in this study.
How long are you off the chest? In a 30-minute code, how long are you off the chest for the 50% compression fraction rate? 15 minutes. Well, how about I put you on ECMO and turn it off for 15 minutes? You're dead, and I didn't even use the F word, right? You're dead. I don't know how to say that, but that's considered high-quality CPR. Same with the Rock Prime study. They considered high-quality CPR compression fractions of over 50%. Seriously?
So Joe had to go to Indonesia because we proved this with medics in the United States lots and lots of times. But it's less painful to say, oh, in some other country they're not good at manual CPR, even though they're human beings. So what's that?
And so
say, Joe?
we're in Jakarta just 4 weeks ago or something like that. Brooke, where'd you go? And we did a CPR challenge there. Dr. Jot did this challenge, and we took about 100 people in the conference that we're doing. We put them all in the corner and said, you're going to do manual CPR without feedback for 1 minute. 1 minute, no distractions, not 3 in the morning, nobody screaming and yelling at you, no defibrillation, no epinephrine, no intubation, just compressions, 1 minute without feedback, and you're going to do a minute with feedback. So what you can see here is, without feedback, this is groups 1 through 4, or A1 through B2. 18%, 12.6, 6.8, and 14.2. They were in depth and rate. Okay? With feedback, markedly better, right? 57%, 60%, 27%, 42%. Next slide, sir. So this is the average, right? So without feedback, 13.15% of the time, they were within rate and depth. With feedback, 47% of the time. 1 minute, no distractions, in the corner of a room, medical professionals, 47% of the time with feedback. So question 1, do you want feedback or no feedback? You can't live without feedback, right? You can triple your compression fraction and you're in range here by having feedback. Question 2 is 47% of the time good enough?
Some people live despite your best efforts, right? I mean, you can do really crappy CPR and some people will live. So don't use that as a driving force for your decision making, though. You know, that's reinforcing bad practices because you were lucky, and we did it forever. So here's the common manual compression problems, at least what we've experienced. Rate, it's always too fast. Sometimes it's slow, but if you train on doing good CPR, people that are trained to do good CPR and train frequently, the rate is too fast. Bystanders, it's too slow, but medical professionals, it's too fast. If it's too fast, there's no recoil. And the depth consistency is all over the place, but they're almost always under depth. Because if you were over depth and too fast, that's not humanly possible, right? That's too much distance to travel in that amount of time. And then pauses. Pauses happen all the time. Why do you pause CPR? Analyze, pulse checks, intubate sometimes. A lot of you are firefighters, shiny objects. What happens when you pull your hands off their chest? Do you immediately go right back to compressions? Have you ever seen someone pull their hands off their chest and somebody didn't start compressions for 10 seconds, 30 seconds, until somebody else told them, hey, back on compressions? That never happens in the ER, right? You know, someone writes something down and they don't get back on. It happens everywhere.
Jeremiah, what was your experience before we started this program with pauses?
A lot of them.
He was perfect every time, though, according to his documentation.
Yeah. No, there's a lot. Especially trying to integrate without a pulse before we really about it today and tell us. It was a lot more than we would want it to be, I'm sure.
That's a good segue. That's real patient in Rialto.
Not 8 months ago, right? We focused on this. We focused on this, and this is a real patient that didn't fit the auto pulse criteria. So this is manual compression.
10% in depth, we're under. 0% in depth, we're over. 3.6 inches. Now, this patient, 3.6 inches was probably appropriate. So it's a very, very, very large gentleman who lived, by the way. How about this one? 1% in target rate, 152. How did he get 152 compressions a minute? That's pretty good. But it's what happened. That's the data. So here is an old school, and by old school I mean a year ago, manual compressions, cardiac arrest, longest pause 47 seconds, 35 seconds, 25 seconds. Would you give me that in your system today you have those pauses? No? People are shaking their head no. Do you know that, or you just don't think you do? I'm looking at Twalton because she was shaking her head. I apologize, ma'am. You shouldn't. I would agree with you shouldn't. Do you know that you don't? Do you have data to show that you never have pauses of that length?
With us, but we do feedback on every cardiac arrest.
Awesome.
Report. So
Good.
we watch it really close.
So that's how you know. How many of you, if you don't have feedback, how would you know? Unless you have body cameras.
Ask crews, right? They'll tell you they didn't have no pauses. Right? There was no pauses, and they're not lying. It's just that they're busy doing stuff. They're trying to take care. They're trying to save somebody's life, right? There's no we wasn't really pauses until you put it up on the screen and go, yeah, I think there was, right?
But you can save people with 80% compression fractions. That's good. That's good CPR. But it's not just the compression fraction, right? It's rate, depth, recoil.
So when we got the auto pulse in 2009, when Zoll tried to convince me that I had to have these auto pulse machines, right? And I'm like, all right, they look pretty trick. They're good things, right? Let's do it. So I bought some out of the sales reps' trunks because I didn't have any money. And
I don't know if they work for Zoll. They might have been a freelance pharmaceutical representative.
I buried him in a lease of a couple of ambulances and didn't tell anybody I was buying them. And he wasn't the chief at the time, so he can't fire me for it. So in 2009. We bought them in 2015, our ROSC rate, when we started measuring it, because we were on paper PCRs before that, right? We weren't measuring anything. So we got a QI guy, Kevin Dearden, who's our QI guy, came in. We went to ePCRs. We started getting data. We started crunching data. So in 2015, we were at 23% ROSC, first half of the year. We said, okay, that's good. I don't know why that's not better, though. Right? The number should be better. We feel that number should be better. We have these great machines. We got circumferential compressions. We got a ton of cerebral perfusion. Things are going fairly well. We think that number should be better. So why is that not better?
Another way to say that is the men and women that work for the Rialto Fire Department are excellent people that were doing exactly what they were trained to do, but the outcomes were we were doing a crappy job. It's not their fault. They didn't build the system. They were doing what we asked them to do. We just weren't paying attention. No one was minding the store, right? So whose fault is that? Well, that's my fault technically. So, I got people that work for me and crap rolls downhill. So it's like, Joe,
It
fix
became
this.
my fault. So we're doing it wrong, right? So we look at the auto pulse, and we went out in the fields, are looking at what they were doing.
Jeremiah, what is the orange and green button?
Orange is stop, green is start. So take the orange on off.
So we let you turn it off?
Sometimes.
Sometimes?
In very rare circumstances.
So this device is the auto pulse, if you haven't seen it. Absolutely freaking worthless. Seriously. Worthless. If you turn the freaking thing off all the time. If you pause it to check a rhythm, if you pause it to check a pulse, if you pause it to give drugs, if you pause it to intubate, well, then you might as well throw it in the freaking trash. You can't pause it, right? So we came up with the nothing trumps compressions, right? Never. Nothing trumps compressions, nothing. So tell me one thing that you do that should trump compressions. Anything. What do you do that should trump compressions? What? Applying the auto pulse? Okay, I can live with that. If you are going to have something that trumps compressions, it better have a damn good outcome, right? You better have a reason. You better have a good reason for it. You say defibrillate? Yeah. So I would agree. But I don't necessarily agree. We'll talk about it. But
We don't pause to defibrillate.
yeah, we defibrillate with the auto pulse going. There's some way, but we can show you how to minimize that. But so if nothing, and we can pretty much agree here that nothing trumps compressions, and we don't have anything in our toolbox that's better than compressions, why are we stopping compressions to do stuff? I'm a genius, but that doesn't make sense to me, right?
So those of you that have mechanical CPR, Lucas Auto Pulse, do you ever stop it? What is it set to? When you turn it on, what does the auto pulse go to? 30 to 2, and then you have to manually change it to, why? Why not just set it to continuous? You can, by the way. No, it's not programming. You can just 4 keys and you just change it. Boop, 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 boop. Now it's continuous all the time. That's what ours do. Why? Just a question. You can do it however you want. So auto pulse compression fraction. So would you give me that this one's different? These are poorly. These 2 arrests at the top have too many pauses for too long. In our system, this one's 93%. This one's 87% compression fraction. The longest pause was 4.4 seconds. That's too much in our system. But those are both neurologically intact survivors.
So we'll define what acceptable pauses are for you. I think in here somewhere, but.
So that's does the blue and gray look different with hands versus mechanical CPR? It does, but it only looks different if you use mechanical CPR different than hands. If you let people turn it off at the same rate, you know.
So this is this maybe a year ago. This is a year ago, maybe somewhere. This is one of our patients, and their end-tidal CO2 remains nicely above 40 until we have these pauses. So you see these 2 significant pauses here, right there and right there, right? Those are problems. Why are we pausing it? And this crew, when I brought them in, good crew, good guys. Were there any pauses in your cardiac arrest? No, sir. And when you do this, when you have the data and you go, this patient I think had a significant amount of emesis in their lungs, and so every time we did compressions, it blew out the tube, and so they had to pause the suction. It's the only way they could not get showered with vomit. But what happens to the end-tidal CO2? It drops down to the teens, not where you want it. Saturations start sucking real quick. By the way, when we see ROSC, we're seeing ROSC, which is why we instituted you got to stay on the team for 30-minute thing. But when we see ROSC, we see 12 to 15 minutes of continuous compressions. Every time you pause it, every time you push a pause button, you bought yourself another 12 to 15 minutes before we're going to get ROSC back. Almost across the board, 12 to 15 minutes. You pause it to check a rhythm, you pause it to put an airway in, you pause it to check a pulse. If they don't have a pulse, you buy yourself another 12 to 15 minutes before we're going to get ROSC back. That's what the data looks like.
How'd that person get all that vomit in their lungs or their airway? Yeah, somebody bagged them flat a lot before we got there, right? There's a whole bunch of cool things about heads-up CPR. One of them is that, I'm not sure about Oregon or Washington, but in California, stuff rolls downhill. Gravity works in California. And so the force vector of an auto pulse compression doesn't push anything up when they're in heads-up position. And so you never have airway problems heads up because everything rolls down. There's a reason why docs, anesthesiologists intubate people heads up and leave them there if they can. So our cardiac survivability tools came out of looking at all the ways we messed up, all the ways we did things wrong for a long time. And the first tool is continuous uninterrupted compressions using a mechanical CPR device, in our case, the circumferential squeeze of the auto pulse. And then there's a laundry list more up there, and so we'll go through them. The second one is an impedance threshold device. It's called the Rescue Pod. How many of you said you use this? Gig Harbor. How many of you have heard of it? What have you heard about it?
They don't work.
You've heard that there was a well-constructed, well-done statistically valid research, the ITD versus sham, that said that this has no improvement in neurologic outcomes. That's what you read, right? Dr. Ofterheide's work. Did you read the follow-up paper in Circulation from Dr. Yiannopoulos and Dr. Ofterheide that looked at that same data and said, okay, we were right the first time. It doesn't. But if you're doing high-quality CPR, does it make a difference? Remember yesterday Dr. Lehrfeld said subsets, looking at subsets, you know, shockables, ones that got AED placement before arrival, subsets of that data. So if you look at the subset of data that was high-quality CPR, again, defined at 50% compliance with depth and rate, didn't address recoil at all, what was the impact of this device? A tripling of neurologically intact survival? Doubling? 1%?
It was double, wasn't it?
It was double.
And that's
Ballpark.
double neurologic survival. That's not double ROSC.
So another way to say that is if you do crappy CPR, this doesn't help. In fact, it could hurt them if you do really crappy CPR. Anything can hurt somebody if you do really crappy CPR. We use the rescue pod because we do good CPR. Tualatin Valley does good CPR. Most of you do good CPR, but if you're going to work them for 30 minutes, you have the potential that it's not going to be great long enough for the patient, right? So ITD, how does it work? Anybody know? Anybody got a degree in physics?
So in October of 15, we introduced the rescue pod. And with some more education, which can be a confounding factor, but on continuous compressions and the rescue pod, we went from 23% to 40% ROSC in that final quarter. Those numbers have remained there. So
An ITD fits into the airway circuit on a face mask or advanced airway. During chest compression, the ITD's valve opens, and air is forced out of the body and through the ITD without resistance. But as the chest wall recoils, the ITD's valve closes and selectively prevents air from being drawn in.
Jeremiah, can you throw out balls?
Preventing the
So, first of all, that's the same guy that does the AHA video, so I know at least half of you started to fall asleep. Did it make sense? Does the video make sense? That's good. You're all smarter than me, which is fine. So, it
I got plenty.
it's a cool device. But, you know, when you're explaining things to firefighters or fire chiefs, you got to keep it simple. So put the ball in your hand. Imagine that ball is your teeny tiny heart. I got a bigger one. Put the ball in your hand. So you're alive right now, right? Most of you. And when you breathe in, you're changing inner thoracic pressure. Will you give me that? What happens when you breathe in? What happens to your vasculature and to intracranial pressure and cerebral perfusion pressure? Anybody know? The doc says your intracranial pressure goes up when you breathe in. That's true. Every time you breathe in, your intracranial pressure goes up. And if you were dead, your cerebral perfusion pressure would go down. But you have vasculature that can be responsive to that, right? So you can adjust your intracranial pressure. You have tolerances for it, but if you needed more cerebral perfusion during that time, then your arteries and your veins can adjust, right? Your vasculature can adjust. Your contractility, your stroke volume, things can adjust, right? So, because your system works. What about when you're dead? You have any of those things working for you? No, not so much. And when you're dead, what do we do to move blood around in your system? We do compressions, right? Hopefully, if you're doing it manual, 110 to 120 times a minute. If you're using the auto pulse, it's 80 times a minute with the circumferential squeeze. So 80 to 120 times a minute, we squeeze your chest cavity, and when we let go on the recoil phase, what happens? Air rushes into your lungs. So 80 to 120 times a minute, air is rushing into your lungs. which is increasing intracranial pressure, decreasing cerebral perfusion pressure. It's kind of blocking up stuff in the brain, which decreases how much blood comes out of the brain, which decreases preload. And it also is squeezing the heart, which is decreasing coronary artery perfusion. 80 to 120 times a minute, we're doing that to you because we're doing compressions, and on the recoil phase, air is rushing in and increasing pressure in your chest. Does that somewhat make sense? The squeeze ball analogy is this. The air rushes in, it squeezes your heart. So that's what your heart looks like. And it stays that way. A heart like this, can it move more blood, or a heart like this move more blood? And if I squeeze a heart, what's the coronary arteries do? They get squeezed too, so your heart's not going to perfuse that much, right? We say, oh, the heart's perfusing during diastole. Do you have diastole under CPR? No, the heart's not beating. So it's being perfused on the upstroke and the downstroke, but if you keep the heart squished, it's not perfusing that well, right? So the ITD keeps air from rushing into the lungs on the recoil phase of compression so that your heart stays full the whole time. By staying full the whole time, coronary arteries are perfused better. You don't increase intracranial pressure as much, which doesn't decrease cerebral perfusion pressure, which lets more blood run out of the brain and down into the heart, which increases preload. So it's good for the brain, it's good for the heart. It's a blood in, blood out thing. All with a... So just if that was you and you had to die, would you rather have high intracranial pressure and low cerebral perfusion pressure, low coronary artery pressure, and low preload, or would you rather those things be closer to normal? It's you or your family. That's what it is. But you got to do good quality CPR.
So ICP is your enemy, right? Especially in cardiac arrest here. Now we're managing ICP every moment of every second right now when your heart's beating. But when you're
Wait, I need all the squeeze balls back. No, just kidding.
No. when you're cardiac arrest, that's not happening. And so every time you do a compression, we're slamming ICP through the roof and frying a bunch of cells. So think about this. This is a blood in, blood out process. We tend to, especially as medics, think of this, everything as a blood in process. We just got to get blood there. We just got to get blood there. We just got to get blood there. But you got to start thinking of this as a blood in, blood out. You got to get acidotic, hypoxic blood out of the brain. You got to decrease ICP and get good oxygenated blood back into the brain. Both sides of it, right? You got to do both sides. So a rescue pod, negative pressure in the chest, good drainage out of the brain. We can get good blood in the brain. Blood in, blood out. Blood in, blood out. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But is this me?
Sure.
So I think the chief makes me do this because I can't say oxygenation, but so apneic oxygenation, we started this process basically putting a nasal cannula on patients at 15 liters prior to intubating them. We started this process basically because after we started saying you can't stop the autopulse to intubate, right? Because nothing trumps compressions, nothing. Our intubation rate, success rate went down a little bit, right? We lost about 10, 15% success rate first pass. Like, well, what do we do with that? Well, obviously stop the autopulse. No, that's not the answer, right? The answer is never stop compressions, right? So what do we do with that? So how long do you have to intubate? In the real world, you were taught 20 seconds, 30 seconds, however long you can hold your breath, right? That's what we're all taught. Same, yeah. And so my guys need to get that done. The trachea is moving around a little bit because the autopulse is going. What do we do to buy them more time? So in Rialto, how long do we have to intubate? I don't care. I don't
That's
care.
the first time he said that with no cuss word.
Thank you. Right? Keep their sats good, end-tidal CO2 good, and I don't care if it takes 5 minutes to intubate. I don't care. You're perfusing the brain. We're doing good. So I don't care how long it takes to intubate. So then we get our success rates back without having to turn off the autopulse. There's cannula at 15 liters. The autopulse, because of its circumferential squeeze, tends to create this about 80. When we first started looking at data, we were like, what are those 80 ventilations? Oh, those are 80 really micro ventilations that we're getting from the autopulse. So it's moving oxygen when we're not ventilating at all. So a nasal cannula at 15 liters gets us the saturation that we need, and we don't have to worry about how fast we get the tube in. Takes as much time as you want.
Capnography and pulse oximetry maintained.
Yep.
And we see that in real humans. In the porcine model, you see it for 6 hours. So they don't have to ventilate. Now, I'm not saying that those lungs are in good shape after 6 hours. They worked for 6 hours. They probably would, die from
Saturation is maintained over 80,
Atelectasis
86%, 80, 84%, I can't remember,
in those models.
for that period of time.
And then we do heads up CPR. Yes, sir.
Apneic oxygenation, at what point in time during the resuscitation do you apply that?
It-
If you're washing out the nitrogen, you're adding oxygen to the bellows effect, presumably, right?
So we are only doing it from, and you'll see in the station, so when we walk in the door, we do CPR like everybody else. We do a BLS airway two-handed seal with an ITD and capnography. We're 30 to 2, and people are like, oh, you said no pauses. Well, with a BLS airway, you have to pause for ventilations. Ventilations are important. There's partial collapse of the pulmonary vasculature in a post-ROSC environment. It's not like it's not like you could look at it. It looks like it fell apart, but it's not able to carry as much blood, and it's not able to exchange nearly as much gases in a post-resuscitation environment. The way to fix that is just to give a couple of appropriate breaths, 2 to 4 breaths, so 30 to 2 for the first little bit. Then we will transition them to the auto pulse. We stop bagging them at the time of the auto pulse. Transition, put them on, and then they're on the apneic oxygenation just until an advanced airway is placed.
So at that point in time.
Yeah, so it's generally a 30 to 90 second endeavor for us, but it maintains those pulse oximetry readings and those end-tidal CO2 readings, and it gives us that social engineering to keep our medics from turning off the auto pulse.
And the reason that you don't do it before the bag valve mask?
Because we're on supplemental oxygen with the bag valve mask, so you have to unplug one and plug in the other. You could. There's no doubt. You can do it from the beginning. You know, there's no downside to doing it, except for the fact that if you have a nasal prong in at 15 liters a minute and you want to get end-tidal CO2 readings off a BLS airway, you won't get them because of the void spacing. So heads up CPR. This is one of like really aptly named things because it's CPR with a head up. So back to our analogy with the squeeze ball. If you grab your squeeze ball again, I'm going to say that this is your brain. Firefighters in the room, a hydrant at the end of a court, dead end hydrant. Does it fill up with rocks? And it's not a great hydrant because it's at the end of a circuit. And how do you get water, back down the pipe from that? You don't, right? It's at the end of the loop. Well, your brain is kind of the same thing. So here's your brain. It is under CPR conditions, it's got blood that's hypoxic. It's got blood that is acidotic, and we want to get it out of the brain, right? And here's your heart. And this is how we do CPR all day long. They're at the same level. Well, again, I don't know if gravity works different up here, but in California, if I were to raise your head above the level of your heart, what happens to that hypoxic or that deoxygenated acidotic blood that's in the brain? Does it run downhill? Running downhill gets it out of the brain, which increases cerebral perfusion, decreases ICP, it increases preload. You don't have as much regurgitation in the brain. So it's good for the heart, it's good for the brain. And it's free, which I like, because this is not free. It's valuable, but it's not free. So those have a synergistic, heads up and ITD have a synergistic relationship. They both impact the same things to a greater extent than either one of them do by themselves. So that's heads up. It's not rocket science. People ask us all the time, oh, so you're willing to do that just on pig models? There is a ton of research, and by a ton, I mean a ton of research on heads up. It doesn't come in the cardiac arrest state. Have you ever gone to an ICU and seen someone that was in a prolonged hyperperfusion state or has a traumatic brain injury? Are they laying flat? No, they're at 30 degrees. Why? Because physiologically, that's the best angle for them to be at. Why? So that stuff rolls downhill. And you don't adversely impact the heart, because the heart still has to pump stuff back uphill, right? So, heads up. There are porcine models, there are cadaver models, they're the analogous that Dr. Lehrfeld talked about, but there are real human beings that are alive that have received heads up CPR. Talking about close to 3,000 cases of heads up CPR in this country last year between all the agencies that do it. So it's not published data, but it's not, most of the things that we do in EMS are some kind of analogous to something else, right? So there is not a paper that I know of that speaks to the value of CPR versus the placebo case of no CPR, right? It's hard to find the control group for that. It's like the parachute. Nobody wants to be in the control group for whether a parachute is valuable when jumping out of an airplane. So, exactly. So, we do heads up CPR. It's complicated. Raise the head to 30 degrees. All the stuff that I just said. Here is the porcine model. There's a linear relationship between the angle and how much ICP goes down as you raise it, and there's a linear relationship with how much cerebral perfusion goes up as you raise it. That's all good. Most people will look at this graph and say, hey, how come you only do 30? It looks like cerebral perfusion continues to increase as you go up and up and up, and that's true, it does. But remember, we still have to pump all the blood around their body. The higher we raise them up, the more head pressure we have to overcome with your manual or mechanical CPR, the worse it ultimately is for the patient, and it will decrease preload anything over 30 degrees. So, because you're not able to circulate the blood. So that's why it's 30
Kind
degrees.
of a sweet spot, 30 degrees.
Coronary and cerebral perfusion.
Make the mic closer. So this is a heads down, supine and heads up model. That's also a porcine model. Coronary perfusion pressure, and you can see 30 degrees down, and to flat and to 30 degrees up. Same with the cerebral perfusion pressure. This actually came out of, I believe, South Korea. So we were just in South Korea not too long ago, and they have these huge high-rise living apartment buildings that are 100 stories tall, and they have a problem. They never built the elevators to fit a gurney. So they have to do one of two things with their patients to get them in cardiac arrest, to get them in the elevator. They got to sit them up or lay them or put them down. So they tried to figure out what the best way to do this was, and in the pig model, it's very clear that heads up is far superior to heads down. It's a blood in, blood out process, right? Blood in, blood out, blood in, blood out. We gotta get good blood in, get good blood out, or pour blood out.
You all use capnography, waveform capnography. You're required to use it. Somebody looking at the screen all the time. You train on what the little thing means, what this waveform means. Yes, no, maybe, some. Is this waveform any good? Yeah, it's pretty good. You train what auto-generated respiratory drive looks like the patient starts to breathe on their own? No. You train on what a diminishing CO2 or a dislodged airway or poor seal on a BVM looks like? Yeah? No? So here's how you would know. If you can't go to the board and draw it, you're not training on it. So that's okay. It's all right.
So why do we base a lot of our care, or all of our care in cardiac arrest, on capnography? Because it tells us something. What's going on when you have a capnography reading? You have a cell somewhere in the body, right? That's taking in oxygen, using ATP, turning out CO2. It's alive, it's doing something. You have metabolism, you have crap happening. So that's why we base almost all of our care on the capnography number. Is there going to be a better number someday? Probably. It may not be capnography. But right now, it's the best we have to determine what's going on inside the body at the cellular level.
What's a good reading? What's a normal reading? 35 to 45? Are you sure? It's not 30 to 40? Is it highly variable based on the human being? Does it matter on your age or your medical condition, whether you have COPD, whether you have asthma? Yeah, but the cool part is, whether you say 30 to 40 or 35 to 45, under 15, not gonna live, right? So you're looking for, the range is okay. You're not looking for an exact number, right? But yes, you wanna be right there. And so until they get there, the way to get end-tidal CO2 to go up is high quality CPR, because that's what moves the blood, that moves the oxygen, that allows the cells to operate aerobically instead of anaerobically, right? And then slow down your breathing. Because if you increase breathing, what happens to end-tidal CO2? It drops. What happens when you get rid of, if you bag them too much, like we played with this in head trauma for a little bit until we figured out it was stupid. What happens if you breathe a whole bunch for somebody? What happens to their vasculature? Can it constrict? Is that a good thing? Well, seemingly it would be a good thing, right? You constrict it, you shrink the size of the pipes, you have the same volume. What should happen to pressure? It should go up, and it does go up. But what happens to the brain? Decreased perfusion, yeah. So, and we're already in a hypoperfusion state, right? So that's, and why does it do that? What's the relationship between the CO2 and that? Does your brain have receptors? Say, I have this amount of CO2, this amount of acidosis in my body, so I'm going to adjust? It does. So it's complicated. I'm too dumb for that, but that's the best tool we have today to measure. Till January, when Joe's going to make all of our medics put regional oximetry on their forehead, which will measure analogous oximetry of the brain and forward flow under CPR conditions. So
Frontal lobe oximetry, like we'll know.
come back
whether or not
next year.
They're perfusing the brain or not.
So what decisions do we make with capnography? I don't know.
Should be another one. There we go. So we use capnography to determine defibrillation.
We'll talk about that in a minute.
Whether we're going to defibrillate, the quality of our CPR, ventilation rate and depth, what we talked about a little bit ago.
End-tidal CO2 goes down over the length of the arrest. What does that generally mean? Dead? Or not good CPR? One of the two.
No,
right?
I'll give you a third one, but
So
tube's not in the right place.
Tube's not in the right place. All right, so probably should figure out which one it is before you say, they're dead. Like, we did everything we could, end-tidal CO2 trended down, and we just call them, right?
So time on scene, right? And so we use end-tidal CO2 to determine how long we stay on scene. ROSC, why do we use end-tidal CO2 to determine ROSC? We use a spike in end-tidal CO2, but why don't we just check a pulse? We got to stop compressions, right, to check a pulse, and I don't want to stop compressions to check a pulse, so we use end-tidal CO2 to check whether or not the patient has a pulse. See that spike, then we'll look, right? We won't even stop compressions if we see a spike in end-tidal CO2. We'll let it go for a couple of minutes, prime the heart, right? Because we talked about this yesterday, I think we did, right? What happens? Everybody in the room's done it, right? We got a pulse back, stop doing compressions, and then they lose a pulse within a minute or two, right? So we want the heart well primed and well oxygenated before we stop.
What happens to pulse oximetry? How many of you use pulse oximetry on all cardiac arrests or any cardiac arrests? What happens to pulse oximetry with ROSC? What's that? Can take a while to catch up. So it goes down for about 30 seconds, markedly down. Why? All your cells are using oxygen, and until you bag in replacement oxygen, that hemoglobin flying around that's empty is going to be measured as empty, right? So that is more noticeable frequently, that number dropping, than the capnography number going up. Because if they were already 30 to 40 and they got a spike of 2, at ROSC, you might not see that. But if they go from 94 to 80 on pulse oximetry, you might see that.
So you were talking yesterday, your blood pressure, you put the blood pressure cuff on, you get about 100 to 108 on the auto pulse. What's your SpO2 typically?
94. In that, I'm sure, Jeremiah, you've probably seen lower numbers, but they're...
It depends on the patient. I mean, sometimes they'll higher numbers, sometimes they're in the high 90s, sometimes they're usually mid to low 90s. For us.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I know it varies from patient to patient, but how significant of a drop in SpO2 are you going to see?
15 points. Is like in the range. You might see none, but it's just another tool. But blood pressure, if they're not going to be waxing and waning cardiac arrest, will be back to what they normally were before. So if their heart generates 140, their blood pressure will be 140, despite the fact that the auto pulse is on, which was only generating 110 to start with. It's a pretty good indication that their heart has taken over, because it has taken over, right? If its blood pressure is still low.
So we determine death with end-tidal CO2, so 15 or below for 10, 15 minutes, and trending downwards, then we'll let them determine death. So just another thing that we use for end-tidal CO2.
Is there, you guys using end-tidal CO2 as a component for determination of death? You have an upper limit, a place where if they reach this, you have to keep working them? Yes?
Yeah.
Yes? What is it?
Anything above 15.
Anything above 15, you have to keep working them? And you do everything else first. Is there any exceptions to that?
If we've been working for like an hour or something like that, we're all out of bed. Sometimes we'll
No, I mean the 15. What if Is there anything where you don't have to work them low?
No head trauma like that, but besides that,
So cold patients?
oh, okay.
Yeah. Work until they're warm? Okay. Drowning patients? How about, do you ever have patients that aren't intubated? Yeah. Do you get to use end-tidal CO2 to call them for that? Not sure? Okay. Just asking questions.
I've never ran into that.
Never ran into that because you just shove a nigel down if you need to, right?
So real quick, we'll talk about BLS capnography and a BLS airway, and but I want to make sure that you know that our capnography numbers in a BLS airway are not as solid as obviously with a tube or an iGel. So just be cognizant of that. And you look at those numbers, and those numbers aren't fantastic because it's a BLS airway. Because we're not moving enough volume. That some of those numbers won't look as good as you think they normally do with a T-tube. So stay in place, save the unshockables. We accidentally, so you might think we're great, we have these great tools, and we came up with this and instituted it, but we accidentally kind of came upon that we were getting ROSC back in asystole patients right around 20-25 minutes. What's going on there, right? I don't know, but guess what? Everybody's got to stay on scene for 30 minutes, right? Because normally I could put 5 medics on scene within 8-9 minutes, right? We'd have everything done in 7 minutes. So, and then we'd do a couple rounds, we'd call them. Well, the problem is we're starting to see ROSC at 20-25 minutes. What do we do with that? Guess what? Everybody's got to stay on scene for 30 minutes. If you have an end-tidal CO2 over 20, you got to stay on scene for a minimum of 30 minutes. That's our rule. So, and is this mine? I don't know. But the rule, the issue here is, so we love Utstein, and this year the chief talked about Utstein, and our Utstein numbers are great, but Utstein comprises what percentage of our patients, sir?
Utstein 2 is like less than 1% of all cardiac arrests, and Utstein 1 is 14.
So
14%.
about 15% of our patients would fit in that Utstein realm where they're shockable, right? And they're witnessed. The other 85% fit in unshockable rhythms. So I got an Utstein number, I think it's 83%. So I can run around and say, hey, 83%, 83%, we're cool, we're cool, we're cool. 85% of my patients are dying because they're not shockable, right? And our goal, and my direction from him, right, is to save people's lives, have them walking and talking at the end of the day. So I got to fix the unshockables. So stay on scene for 30 minutes. So the first half of 2017, our average on scene time was 23 minutes, and our ROSC rate was 23% for non-shockables. What?
13 minutes.
What did I say?
You said 23.
Oh. So 23% ROSC. Second half 2017, got an average time on scene 24 minutes, 42% ROSC.
It's the only material change we made there. And those are different patients, so there can be some, bias there. There can be some other things, but we know that we got their pulses later after we would have left, after we would take them to the hospital, after they would have called them. So if we're going to get pulses back on the non-shockables, it's going to be later, and so we stay longer. Jeremiah's had ones, we've had them 45 minutes now.
Yeah, I mean, I've had multiple patients that 5 years ago, we would have left them on scene and called the coroner. And 30, 35 minutes in, I started looking, like, oh man, they got blood pressure. Oh, got a pulse. This person, even, 3 years ago, probably, left them for the coroner and went home. So there's probably a lot of people that we definitely called that if we were doing this, they could be alive. So the long on-scene time, it is hard sometimes. It's hard to convince people to do it sometimes. But after you see the 2, 3, 4 of them, you realize it's not a fluke. It's, for whatever reason, it's what happens somewhere in that 20 to 30 minute range where a lot of times we weren't working on for nearly that long. We never saw the potential.
Limiting the survivor pool. Yes, sir. You had a question?
What's your walkout rate on that?
It's about half.
Yeah, the 39% ROSC, 20%
Survival discharge.
survival.
CDC, but survival discharge.
So I don't know if it's relevant, but earlier this year I worked a woman for 4 hours.
Really?
Busy ER, and she left the hospital in a taxi cab.
Of course it's relevant.
So I mean, that's a long time.
But people don't they want double-blinded, prospective, blah, 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 right? Well, so that's, those are great. However, that anecdote is a real living person. And if you're not a research physician, then my guess is you care about real living people, right? And so I understand you don't want to do something that you think might harm somebody, but if you don't want to do something just because there's not a double-blinded study on it, that's a different story. Absolutely, and we've had cases in California, 6 hours under mechanical CPR until ECMO to go team could get there, cannulated, almost 7 hours into the incident, taken to a cath lab, 7 days later, woke up, take off ECMO, and neurologically intact.
Shocked, 30 or 40 times over a period of hours.
Yep. So we are going to take a break here. I'm going to leave that on the screen because it'll probably make some people mad. But there's some snacks and some drinks, and some Salem folks have just come into the room, and if they're new guys, they have to introduce themselves after the break. But lunch is here. Then let's do lunch.
Can we do 10 minutes and then maybe continue?
We can.
Yeah.
Everybody grabs food?
Yep.
Yeah.
So let's do this. Let's take 10 minutes. Answer your phone calls, look at your emails, do whatever you need to do. Use the bathroom. Come back in, get your food. We'll give you some time sitting down to eat, and then we'll start back up while you have your food. So this slide right here. Early defibrillation is early until it's not, which makes sense if you think about it, but it's a complicated thing. We are not advocating to not defibrillate patients that defibrillation will, in any respect, have a good outcome for them. We are advocating for, as many other places have done, that patients in fine ventricular fibrillation, especially those with prolonged downtimes, that's what got you to fine ventricular fibrillation, do not respond appropriately or in the fashion that you would like to electrical therapy. Their response is pretty universally, their heart says, I'm done. So they go into asystole and they stay there. And the reason for that is quite simple, is just like everything else, they're hypoxic and acidotic, and they've been down for a while. And we can fix those things to the extent possible with what? How do we fix underlying acidosis and hypoxia in a patient that's been down for a little while? We do high quality CPR, right? We do it without stopping, and we don't bag for them too much. And we can fix those underlying things. And then what will happen to the coarseness of that VFib? It gets bigger, coarser, wider. And then what do we do with it? We shock it into what? A pulsing rhythm. That's the goal, right? So are there other systems that do this? Yes. So Gig Harbor is a Medic One program, and Seattle has been for a very long time. What do they do with unwitnessed arrests? What's the first intervention for unwitnessed arrests? No matter what the rhythm? CPR. Do they shock people in VFib with an unwitnessed arrest? Every time. No, what do? 5 minutes of CPR? Why? Because they don't want to shock them to asystole, right? Because their system was built for VFib. They didn't know at the time that non-shockables might be survivable, right? They built a really awesome system, but it was built around the motto that everyone in ventricular fibrillation lives, right? And so they want that to happen. They don't want to have a fallout where they shocked them into asystole and didn't save them. So they looked at their data, and you get to that. That's an oversimplification, but what we're trying to do is apply the same thing, but use the tools that we use today to drive that, right? So we say if it's fine VFib, that you don't shock it. If it has an end tidal CO2 over 20, you could shock it. And what would that mean? It looks like fine VFib, but the end tidal CO2 is over 20. Well, those two things don't match. Because if they're producing that much CO2, then it's not fine VFib. It's a timing thing. But there's research on, it's in hospital research, but there's research on the ability to cause cessation of ventricular fibrillation by defibrillation, and it's corollary to the patient's end tidal CO2. So essentially, with the exception of one fallout in the research, people cannot be converted with end tidal CO2s under 15. and most can't be converted under 25. And also, some can't be converted in very, very high end-tidal CO2 numbers, and those are the patients that have been dead for a very, very long time but had high end-tidal CO2 numbers to start with. But the sweet spot is somewhere between 18 to 25. So there's other places that would advocate for, well, some places would say unwitnessed arrest, just do CPR for 5 minutes. Other places will say on fine VFib or end-tidal CO2 under 25. Ours is 20. So we're just looking to not injure a patient. It's the kind of the do no harm thing. It is the most controversial thing generally, that and epinephrine that we do. So at the end of the day, our data is that for all patients, all comers in ventricular fibrillation and pulseless ventricular tachycardia, shocking with an end-tidal CO2 under 20 is 0% ROSC, which if they didn't get ROSC, they didn't survive, right? I don't know a lot, but I'm pretty confident that if we didn't get their heartbeat back, that they didn't survive. And then for those that we shock with an end-tidal CO2 over 20, it's at 82% ROSC. And that's multi-year retrospective. That's all cases, all comers in a shockable rhythm. So which category, if that's your family member, which category you want to be in? That's what we're trying to avoid. We weren't trying to be controversial. We weren't trying to make anybody mad. We're just trying to say, demonstrably, we hurt people if we shock them in fine VFib under 20, and we help them if we shock them, if we do something to get them over 20 or get them into a coarser VFib. And that's it. That's all we're trying to do. So if you can't do it, you don't want to do it, you think we're wrong, that's awesome. Please tell us. Send us an email when you have a better way. Because today we don't have a better way to know which ones are not going to convert. But in our system, we know that 20 number is pretty good. So you're not talking about 10,000 cases. You're not talking about a rock trial. But we weren't willing to continue to shock people into death when we had the data in our system that said we probably shouldn't do this.
So, deprioritizing epinephrine. There's a complex statement on the board. We don't give the drug, he'll be more likely to go home alive and his brain will work better. So we believe this to be the case. So what do we know happens when we give epinephrine to our patients? We know cerebral perfusion goes down, ICP goes up, drainage out of the brain goes down, intrathoracic pressure goes up, and we fry a bunch of brain cells.
But preload goes up.
It does.
Cardiac output increased even under CPR
right?
conditions, so your pressures go up. So
Okay.
it works. Epi does something, right? Would you all agree with that? It does something.
Come on. So does epi increase ROSC rates? Yep, it does.
Depends
Right?
on which
Absolutely.
study you read, but the preponderance of evidence is yes.
Epi increases ROSC rates, so we should give epi as early as we can, as often as possible, right? But that's not our goal, right? We could all have ROSC rates in the 80% range tomorrow. Dump 20 milligrams of epi on every patient, right? We're going to get a pulse back, and we're going to have great ROSC rates, and everybody's going to be planted in a acute care facility, and they're going to stay there for the next 20 years, right?
If you
We're
count
not
5
getting the brain
seconds as
back.
ROSC, is ROSC. But, it's true.
So, go ahead, sir.
Go ahead and what?
So we're trying to slow down epi. So if you look at the recent trial, when that trial just came out on
Paramedic
epinephrine,
2.
Go ahead. We're trying to slow this down, by the way. But so you look at this study, and you look at 30-day survival, and we had more patients survive neurologically intact in this study than not neurologically intact. I'm sorry, we had more patients survive in this study than without epi. So epi, more patients survived. Less patients survived neurologically intact. Okay. So here's my basic question to you. If I can guarantee you're going to get ROSC, you, your wife, your family, your kids, somebody that's in cardiac arrest, I can guarantee it tomorrow. I guarantee they're going to get ROSC. Do you want that ROSC with epi or without epi? I give you the choice today. What do you want, with or without epi? Without. Every day of the week. Epi is increasing ICP, frying brain cells, decreasing cerebral perfusion. So you'd take it without epi if you had the choice. Now, if I told you you will not get ROSC without epi, You want the epi? You want the epi, right? So there's a sweet spot here. We want to do everything we can possibly do to get that patient back prior to giving them epinephrine. If we've done all that, and we're not going to get them back, we're not getting ROSC, then epi is probably a reasonable drug at a point. It's never a reasonable drug when they're laying flat without an ITD with crappy compressions, when you're going to just spike their ICP and fry all their brain cells. They're hypoxic and acidotic, and let's give them some epi. Right? That's never the answer. So if you're ever going to give epi, high quality compressions, heads up with a rescue pod in place, not hypoxic, not acidotic blood, and then we give some brain, we're perfusing the brain better. That's when you want to give epi if you have to give epinephrine. So we've delayed this process significantly we do everything we know improves outcomes before we give epinephrine. Everything we know. So we know heads up, we know rescue pod, we know high quality CPR, we know airway control, all the things that we know could improve outcomes, we do, and then we give epi. So the common question is, well, how do you do that? Because your protocol says that you give epinephrine immediately after you gain vascular access, right? Because we're geniuses, how do we fix this? We don't start an IV till the last thing in the code, right? We don't have vascular access, therefore we can't give epinephrine, and we follow our protocol. Right. So
the original idea was that we wouldn't put epinephrine in the drug box, so they couldn't bring it into the house, and he wanted to put it in a cryptix. It's like you have to do this complex math equation and solve it and do all the dials, and then it opens and the epi's inside. So you could, that. But those things were expensive.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So we didn't do that. So the way we do it today, or the way that we would advocate for it, is whatever it is in your system, do the things that you know work first. The engineering of behavior component comes in for this, is that everything you'll see with us today is we do an NG tube on all intubated patients. It helps quite a bit with airways, airway control. It also optimizes the use of the ITD for interthoracic pressure regulation, because a distended stomach with air limits your ability to alter the pressure within the stomach or within the chest wall through the use of an ITD. So the NG tube goes in after the patient's intubated. The person that does the NG tube is the only person that can gain vascular access, and they can only do it after the NG tube's in. That's it. So you can do all of your other stuff, get them intubated, heads up, ITD, high quality CPR, all of these other things. You get an NG tube in, and then you can, if you've been a medic for 4 years or less, drill a hole in their shoulder. If you've been a medic from 4 years to 10 years, drill a hole in their leg. And if you've been a medic for longer than 10 years, you probably put on a tourniquet and look for an IV. And then you can give epi once it's in. And we didn't have to buy the cryptex things to put the epinephrine in. But so that's it. Yes, sir.
Chief, what I'm also hearing you say, but I didn't hear you say it, is that just like delaying defibrillation, epinephrine, as you hit the door, the patient is not ready for that epi.
Yes.
So you're getting a bad outcome because epi in isolation causes decreased neurologic outcome.
Correct.
But if you optimize them by doing all the things that you do to that point, and then you give them a bump of epinephrine, probably it's a good thing in that respect.
Absolutely.
We think that there's a place for it, and we think that, but we know that the place for it is after we do everything else.
Right, because you've set them up for success.
Exactly.
You do defibrillation.
Yep.
Another way to say was don't give epi if their CO2 is less than 20 or whatever you do, but
Sure. That's just another way to look at it. So but then Dr. Lowfeld yesterday talked about the PARC trial, right? And so increased survival with epinephrine administration, especially if given early. Okay, what's the confounding factor? Did they account for quality of CPR? They did not. So if you're gonna take a patient subset of really crappy CPR leads to ROSC at lower rates, right? So you give epinephrine to that same subset of patients, more of them will get ROSC, and therefore more of them will live neurologically intact despite your efforts. That's not a bad study, but it doesn't add to the body of knowledge because it doesn't account for the confounding factors of, yes, we can save some people if we do everything wrong.
right, so another study that needs to be done is to take those two trials, just like we did with the ITD, and look at the subset of the people that got
Yes.
who got good CPR and say, is epi good in those populations?
Right.
Yeah.
And the answer might be yes.
Right. Or it might be no, and then we'll learn something new, right? So the Paramedic 2 trial is a very well constructed study, and I agree it's done in the UK, and I agree that they have very low survival rates, but as the doc noted yesterday, those low survival rates are after you exclude everyone that got ROSC without epi or the placebo. If you include those that got ROSC with before the epi or the placebo, this study got exactly the same ROSC rate and neurologically intact survival as their national average was during the same period. So it matches the data very well. But 21 minutes is the average time to epinephrine administration in Paramedic 2, so that doesn't represent my system. I don't think it represents your system, so I don't think it adds to the body of knowledge of epinephrine. It's not a bad drug. Yeah. So, but we've played, most of you been around long enough to know that there's 4 endogenous catecholamines, right? Right? There's epi, norepi, there's dopamine, there's vasopressin. We've played with all of those, right? And in the pre-hospital arena, we've played with all of those. Most recently, we played with vasopressin, right? And what was the outcomes of that? It did nothing, right? We're playing with it again, but we're playing with a different mechanism. We're saying, hey, you know what? Epi has all these other factors, and what we really want is the squeeze. So let's give them a beta blocker to get rid of the beta impacts of epi and just get the squeeze. Well, what would that be? That'd be vasopressin. We've already done the research on that, but
in the context of what you're discussing.
yes, exactly. So, as Dr. Yiannopoulos would tell you, we got to do all the studies over again. The next part to that, which I don't live in that world, is NIH give me some money to redo all the studies again. But good for them. So
So listen to what these guys are saying, right? So they're saying that if you look at data, the foundation of all of our current data is poor CPR, right? It's crappy CPR. That's the foundation for all the data that we've gathered up until now. So we've got to redo that testing on everything that we've questioned about drugs, defibrillation in a high quality CPR environment, and see what works and what doesn't work, because we really don't know anymore. Most of those are crappy CPR.
So the easy way to say that is the doc gives you glasses, and you can't see through them. And so he's going to give you new glasses, and you can see through them. Things have changed. You need to reevaluate. Are there anybody that has systems where you can't intubate pediatrics? Does that come from a study in Los Angeles and Orange County where they did a prospective randomized trial of intubation of pediatrics and found that there was a negative outcome with pediatrics? Yeah. Was that a good study? It wasn't a great study. But even if it was the best study ever, was it done in the presence of high quality training on pediatric intubation? No. Was it done in the option of a supraglottic airway for pediatrics? No. Was it done when we had waveform capnography for pediatrics? No. So if you have all those things in your system and you're still using that study as the basis for not admitting pediatrics, maybe you need to redo the study. So that's what we're saying. On we go.
So we got to talk about cost per life saved, right? We talked a little bit about this yesterday, right? And it's his fault because he only gives me so much money to work with. So I got a limited bucket, right? And so if I'm going to spend money, I got to spend money where it's going to save the most lives. And so I can't throw $1 million at every patient. What do I do with that? Is this cost effective? Is the cost per life saved reasonable in our environment? And so when you're talking about an autopulse and a band's $100. You're talking about a rescue pod's $100.
It's probably less than that, but round numbers.
Yeah, I don't exactly, but right. So you put an IO needle in them, $100. So we're spending $350, maybe a little more on a code. Now, when you look at it in an environment where you have a 10% ROSC rate, how many patients is it going to take to get one ROSC? It's going to take 10 patients to get one ROSC, right? So 10 patients, I'm not a whiz, but 10 patients times $350, $3,500 to get a ROSC back. That's relatively expensive, right? That's a lot of money thrown at a patient to do that. But when you take all of these together, and you go from 10% ROSC to 60% ROSC, and it takes me how many patients to get a ROSC? Roughly 2 patients, right? To get a ROSC, it means I'm spending $700 to get ROSC. I can do that every day of the week. $700 to get ROSC to save a life. Can I sell it to my council? I can. every day. So got to look at cost per life saved, but get those ROSC rates up, and those numbers change significantly.
And the number's lower than that. But yesterday you agreed that $2,200 a life saved for TXA was okay. So if it's $700 or $300, you take it. Anybody know what the cost per life saved is for cath lab intervention? It's like, yeah, add a couple zeros, and it's still a good investment, right? And a billable procedure. But we don't get any more money because we do this, though, right? In the pre-hospital arena, I don't know how it works here, but we don't get any more money. But the other part of cost of life saved is the revenue generated for the hospital when we bring them someone without a pulse is $0 on average. Sometimes they bill, sometimes they get some money, but the average revenue generated for the hospital is $0. The average revenue generated in our system for a hospital when we bring them someone with a pulse is $35,000. Because that patient is seen in the ER and treated in the ER, and then they go to the cath lab and they're seen there, and then they go to the ICU and they spend some time, and then they go down to a step-down floor, and then they see discharge services, and they're probably, because that hospital saved them, even though you saved them, they'll probably stay with that hospital system for the rest of their life, because they're going to be the person that pisses you off every time, and they're like, I can only go here because my doctor is there, right? You're like, no, you're not going to see your doctor, and you go through that whole argument, right? So they are monetarily invested in you saving more lives. I would suggest you use that with your hospital partners to see if you can make a change or buy some equipment or do something. Because it might not be the first person. It's probably not the ER director. It's probably not an ER doc, but some bean counter in that hospital, MD guy that also, cooks books for a living, will agree with you, and I didn't mean that in a derogatory way, and want to help you. You just have to get in the right door. So you saw this bar graph yesterday. I still don't care what it says. So ultimately it says that before we started, we had 23% ROSC. We added just the ITD, discrete change, 40% ROSC, all tools. If you use all the tools on a patient, 60% ROSC, and all tools seen. Survival, 83%. It varies on the rest of those if the ROSC equates to survival. By and large, we're about 50 to 60% of ROSC patients are survivors, and those are CPC of 3s or less, although we frequently don't get the outcome data. We're a CARES participant, and we have 4 recent survivors that CARES show as dead. One of them we're going to celebrate in front of council. He just witnessed the birth of his first grandson, but CARES says he's dead. So you got to be careful with all of your data. What's that? Yeah, it is rude. Yeah. But maybe there's a tax break there. I don't know. If you're dead and CARES, do you not have to pay federal income?
So we struggle getting CPC scores, right? CPC scores are the gold standard of whether or not a patient's neurologically intact, and we have a hard time getting them from CARES, and we have a hard time getting them from the hospitals. So a lot of our survivors are literally from my CQI guy dialing their phone number and going, Mr. Jones? And Mr. Jones goes, yeah, cool, you're alive, right? That's how that works. So we want CPC scores, and we want to continue to look at those, but unfortunately we can't get them at this point. So.
If you have community paramedics, have them go out and make a community paramedic call on those folks, ask them for their discharge paperwork, call up the discharge coordinator and say, hey, this is community paramedic so-and-so doing a follow-up. I'd like CPC scores on this patient, and remarkably, those folks will give it to you.
So when we first started doing this calls, we literally had no data on it before. It was paper PCRs, and we didn't utilize them well. It was essentially a stack of paper that we got no information from. I brought it over to a spreadsheet, and then I started whittling away, mining the data, looking for trends, looking for patterns of things that are working well, things that were not doing well. Baseline looked like we had work to do. And I started it in 2015 for the first 6 months. I ran the first 6 months of cardiac arrest numbers for that year. And we were at our 23% ROSC rate.
It's not as good as we'd like it to be. We thought it should be better than that. So, is that tool really doing what we want it to do? And you're turning it off to check a pulse, and you're turning it off to check a rhythm, and you're turning it off to innovate, and you're turning it off to start an IV, and you're turning it off to give drugs. And you're doing all that, right? It does no good to have a device that you're turning off. Nothing trumps compressions, nothing. Airway doesn't trump compressions, not in our game. So use the auto pulse correctly, it has significant survivability, significant loss. But we still aren't seeing the numbers that we'd like to see. And so we go back and say, well, what can we do different? Kevin and Chief Grayson bring back the rescue pod.
We implemented the rescue pod in the final quarter of 2015, so in October of 2015. And for those last 3 months, our ROS percentage went up to 40%. Myself, my boss, Joe Powell, and our chief, Sean Grayson, started looking outward to see what other agencies, departments are doing. We noticed that someone in Florida was doing heads-up CPR. You know, we only group performed if you have a mechanical CPR device. Great, we have a mechanical CPR device. We have gurneys that allow us to do heads-up CPR. Oh, and the best thing about that is it works best when you have a rescue pod, and we already had a rescue pod in place. And if you applied all of our interventions, our cardiac survivability tools, we're at 60%. Every time you took one of the tools away, that percentage dropped a little bit. So you take one away, it dropped to 53%. You take two away, it dropped to about 45%. You take them all away, and we were still at 38%. So what that told us is there wasn't a single magic ingredient. There was a system in place that any time we ran the system, it improved our numbers drastically.
There's no magic ingredient. I think you heard that from me yesterday. It's a bundle of care. So, you know, retrospective analysis of when, so as you can imagine, when we started this program, we didn't have 100% compliance, right? Also today, there are many patients that don't get the entire bundle of care. Why is that? Because they get ROS'd before we do everything? That's a good thing. That's a good problem to have, right? But when you look at the data, you got to tease that out because you're like, oh, they didn't do this, they didn't do that, they didn't do the other thing. Well, yeah, of course they didn't. You stop doing the CPR stuff when the person says stop doing that, right? So all the tools, 60%. Take away a tool, it gets worse. Take away 2 tools, it gets worse. Take away 3 tools, it gets worse. Take away all the tools, and you're back to where we were in 2015. So it's not one single thing. There is one single thing that if you take away makes a significant difference, and what is that? You do crappy CPR, universally, it makes them worse, even if you do all the rest of it, right? It can make it worse. It doesn't make it better because it's the baseline and you add everything to it, okay? So while we say there's no magic bullet, certainly the magic bullet that will kill the patient is doing, or some patients, is not doing good. High quality CPR.
So let's, we talk about confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance. So anybody know what this is? Right, this is the
Don't cuss.
Human tendency for us to take things that confirm what we believe, right? So let's say I see a study come across my desk that says the rescue pod's the best thing in the world and we should be using more rescue pods and Rialto's great. What am I gonna do with that study? I'm gonna copy it, I'm gonna send it to all my friends, I'm gonna give it to my chief, I'm gonna do my QI coordinator and say, look at this, we're great. If I get a study in that says rescue pods are killing people, first thing I'm gonna do is put it like on the edge of my desk so I don't have to look at it anymore, right? And then I'll maybe throw it away or maybe we'll talk about it. But I'm gonna continue to look at studies that confirm what I believe. So what you'll know here is that we don't have a double-blind, placebo-controlled, peer-reviewed study on cardiac arrest survivability because we got 7 tools. It took me 6 years to get TXA through the trial study process, and that was quick. It would take me 15 to 20 years to get through a trial study process where we compared every single tool to a control group, and then to another tool, and then to a control group, and then to a different tool and a control group, right? Not saying we don't want to go down that road at some point, but we don't have it, right? There's a reason that trial studies are set up that way so that you don't use cognitive dissonance confirmation bias to continue to prove that what you're doing is right. So I only say this to say that we're very cognizant in Rialto that we don't believe our own crap. So every time we get a study, every time we think we're going down a certain direction, we'll all sit in a room and say, are we full of it? Are we ruling out the study or ruling in the study because it makes us look better, because we can say better things in front of a bunch of people? Are we full of crap or are we not? And we're very cognizant of this process. And if you move forward without peer-reviewed data, you have to be very, very cognizant that you're going to want to do and look at and confirm things that what you believe, right? So we're very careful of that process.
And you saw Kevin Deard in there. We call him California Kevin. He's the one that does the lion's share of our CQI. But by and large, the true value of the CQI process is him or Joe or somebody else talking with the crews filling out the post-analysis critique and emailing it to everybody and getting feedback throughout the organization, and making it not about what the individual did, but what about the system does. And if the individual did something different, analyzing whether that was good or bad and changing the system to improve outcomes for patients, instead of, you know, just saying you didn't, you know, count all of your widgets today, so you're in trouble. Or, you know, is there any data, is there any anecdotal information that suggests that a first intubation success rate of 80 to 90 is better than 90 to 100 for outcomes for patients? Have you ever heard of such a thing? But you probably all heard that, oh, well, our first attempt intubation success rate went down by 5%. What are you measuring? Why are you measuring it? And what are you trying to do? If you're trying to save lives, then do that.
So Jeremiah, have we disciplined anybody ever in Rialto for poor performance and cardiac survivability?
No. You're bothering a lot. But, you know, there's never been anybody that's gotten in trouble. There's people that took a long time to remember and do everything, and it was a lot of reminding, but never any type of discipline, never anything that was negative other than what happened, why did it happen, okay, let's do something different next time.
So because we learned from those failures, we learned from individual failures, we learned the most from epic failures. Those are the things where, what do you want to call the brain fart, you want to call it whatever you want, somebody really did it wrong, right? We learned the most. You saw this picture yesterday. In case you didn't see, the upper right-hand corner, that is the fire that the engine never got to. And it went, you know, a mile that way. That bench burns like every 6 months, Jeremiah. The grass grows back and it burns again. But so that's an epic failure, but we learned a lot from that, right? So there was 4 people on that fire engine, and groupthink took hold, and none of the 4 of them thought what they were going to do was a good idea, and nobody spoke up. So we believe in telling the truth. We believe in challenging assumptions. We believe in the concepts of career resource management, right? So the firefighter sitting in the back could have said, hey, really? This is stupid. But he didn't. And so we learned from that. We learned that the culture of our organization is stronger at keeping you on the track of doing stupid things than the willingness to speak up to your peers. And that's true in every organization. You try to limit it, and we continue to try to limit it. But it was just an example of that. And we have that in the EMS arena, and we have that in the cardiac arrest arena as well. And so what we just want to know is the truth, what happened, so that we can get better as an organization.
Who was the duty chief when that?
It was not me.
Uh-huh.
Maybe it was me. You saw these pictures yesterday. We would encourage you to build a culture of celebration of success. And how many of you recognize your dispatchers when they do dispatcher assisted CPR and somebody's a save? Some? Every time? Yes? Tualatin is awesome. I'll move there. How many of you recognize all your folks? How many of you give feedback every time they go on a cardiac arrest call? How many of you know if the patient you got Roscon survived or not? How many of you get to take them to the hospital in an ambulance, bring them home in a fire engine? That's powerful, right? Take them by the ICU, meet the intensivist, bring them downstairs to the ER, set this all up, meet with the ER doc and the nurse. Have the person that did CPR on them there at their house when they get home. How many of you have challenge coins where one side is the survivor, one side is the person that did CPR, and they get to share that when they come home together? Those are awesome things, right? Number 1 request from cardiac arrest survivors, what do you think it is? They say, hey, is there anything we can do for you? Thank you for letting us be part of your survival. Is there anything we can do for you? Teach my family CPR. Number 1 request.
So this, by the way, this is an EMS pin, right? So this is extremely EMS nerdy, right? I mean, come on, we can EMS geek in our offices, but I got really tough firemen with a bunch of big guns, and nobody's going to wear a stupid pin that says they saved X number of people, right? So every time they get a cardiac arrest save, we change the number on their pin. And it started off like, yeah, whatever, right? But they get excited about this when what? Their buddy has a higher number than they do. That is crap, right? He doesn't have 10. He doesn't have 15. I've got more than him. I know I've got more than him. Why didn't you change my number? I had 2 last week. What are you doing, right? So it's created a good buzz at the department.
The upper right-hand corner is Cynthia. That's open house this year in October. You know, ask the survivors to come back and meet the firefighters and meet the future generation of firefighters and sit with our mayor and our council and, you know, be an advocate for their communities.
So this is kind of putting it all together. Right? This is what it looks like. When we do this thing, people kind of go, what does it look like when you get there? So this is sort of what it looks like.
We come up to the patient, establish patient is unconscious, no pulse. They will immediately begin chest compressions. You see them in the process of deploying the auto pulse with a quick case. They'll make sure that everything's prepared appropriately with the auto pulse, that the auto pulse is on, that the auto pulse band is open, they put carry cases in the proper position, prepare the pads, the defibrillation pads, so that this happens, the time off the chest is very short. They will then sit the patient up, stop compressions. We want to limit this time. Slide the auto pulse underneath the patient, lay them back onto the auto pulse. They will put the auto pulse band together, immediately restart the auto pulse so the time off the chest is as little as possible. Then they will place the straps to appropriately hold the patient in place on the auto pulse. And then deploy the fit case so that they can move the patient quickly onto a gurney. Because nothing trumps compressions, nothing. We set our auto pulses up so that they do continuous compressions regardless of the airway ability. We place a patient on a gurney right after we place them on the auto pulse, and we use a gurney as a tool for innovation. Much like they do in an OR or in an ED, we'll place the patient underneath the cannula at 15 liters, and when our medics are intubating, they have all the time in the world to intubate. We keep an eye on their saturation, and we keep an eye on their entitled CO2, and we're giving plenty of oxygen, and they're blowing off enough CO2 that they can take as long as they want to intubate as long as their numbers stay good. Once we get the tube in the proper spot, the rescue pod goes on, and then the entitled CO2 sensor. We do it in that way on purpose to keep some of the debris out of the entitled CO2 sensor. The rescue pod helps us with blood flow, so getting blood down into the heart and out of the brain and blood into the brain. It increases perfusion. It's a blood in, blood out process. And so the rescue pods helps us with that. And then we base all of our treatments off the entitled CO2. You'll notice that initially or immediately after we've intubated our patient, place them on the entitled CO2 and the rescue pod, we'll set them up. So we base our defibrillation choice on where the patient is with their capnography. We use capnography to basically measure where we are with pH, and we have pH and the saturation of the heart and the blood straight around before the heart's ready for defibrillation. So as you can see, if the patient has a good entitled CO2 of over 20, then we will choose to defibrillate coarse B-fib. We don't defibrillate fine B-fib, we defibrillate coarse B-fib. If the entitled CO2 is below 20, then we'll withhold defibrillation until we get the patient and their pH and their entitled CO2 to a level where we can appropriately defibrillate and successfully defibrillate.
I hate that
Handsome
video
guy,
because
right?
Joe's in it, yeah.
Yeah.
And he's in my office. That's ridiculous. So a couple of things. We make minor tweaks. Jeremiah told you yesterday that we made a series of significant tweaks, and I'm sure that frustrated folks. But a couple of things in that video were purposely done different for ease of the video, and some of them were not. They were mistakes. But one of the things in that video is the cardiac arrest monitors turn sideways. We don't do that. We put it on their femurs, basically, and it's facing up towards the patient's head. And that's because when the person goes to intubate, they have everything they need. The airway, the monitor, the feedback is all in alignment. The cardiac arrest monitor obviously has to be in front of the person. You'll see that in our scenarios that's doing things. There's a pause for puck placement. We do ventilations in the first 2 minutes, 30 to 2. AP pad placement, we talked about that yesterday, that, you know, double or maybe more your first shock efficacy. It may not be. If you have good right now, maybe it's a system, maybe it was something different with us, maybe we didn't train our folks, but there are certainly people that their heart is not strategically located between here and here, as much as it is cupped right here, which is the, you said you have Phillips, right? That is the recommendation of Phillips, anterior posterior pad placement. Do you do anterior anterior or do you anterior posterior?
We started out AA and then after 3 with no change we switched to AAP.
So you start with AA and then you go to the AP. Has anybody noticed any differences, changes between the two? That's the first one I've heard that's interesting. No? They either convert or they don't? All right. Is this a second set of pads? That's expensive. That's cool. That's interesting. In that video, you saw neither AA nor AP. You saw the anterior pad go here and the anterior posterior pad go here. So definitely the heart is not there. So that video is not statistically accurate. We intubate in the heads up position. We try to intubate all patients in the heads up position. You get to do that today. Why do we do that? It's easier, right? Because we can and it's easier. You didn't see that in the video. This is the part where we say, be careful with tube retention devices. Is there one over there? So we talked about earlier that some supraglottic airways have different impacts on intracranial pressure, different impacts on the efficacy of the ITD. Anything can impact intracranial pressure that is pressure on a patient. So if you put the heart monitor in their groin, which a lot of places do, and some of it's resting on the weight of their belly, this is a closed system. Where does that pressure have to go? What's the dead end of that pressure circuit? It goes up and it goes to the brain. You increase intracranial pressure just by putting your hand on their abdomen or the heart monitor, as it were. This cool device right here, it works great, right? Way better than tape. All of us used to use twill tape or use tape of some kind. Where does this thing go on most patients? Where does the strap go? Across the neck. How good are we at decreasing venous return to the heart and increasing intracranial pressure by doing that? So much so that you might as well not use an ITD. So, what do you do instead? Put it on something that's hard. And by hard, I mean not soft, like this part of your neck. So you put it in your mouth, go straight across the ears, back of the occiput. All hard stuff, not affecting your vasculature, not increasing intracranial pressure. You can go home and do that today, help out some of your patients. So it is about outcomes for us. It is about one more Christmas with grandma. It's about the gentleman that had a cardiac arrest at FedEx the other day that got to enjoy seeing the birth of his first grandson. It's about your community. It's about saving lives. For us, it is not about the numbers. We get that people don't want to adopt because of that, but it is about people. I'm going to leave this up here. We're going to switch the slide set, and we're going to walk through 3 discrete stations, what they look like, and once we're done with that, then it will be hands-on for the rest of the day for everyone. But I will stop here and say, what are your questions? Nothing? There's got to be one. Yes, sir.
Question on your all-comers number for cardiac arrest, ROSC. Is everybody included in that number, including people you choose not to work?
Everyone that had an intervention. So if we walk up and they're a DNR, or we walk up and we make a determination of death based on BLS criteria or rigor, then they're not included in that.
Not included.
Right. Everyone that we put a hand on.
Yeah, put hands to the chest.
Is included on
They're
that.
included in that.
Yep. We do CPR for 2 minutes and then we find out they had a DNR, they're included in that. Because it's just easier for us. Yeah. Anybody else? No? Joe's going to talk while I switch the slide set. Here.
What am I going to say?
I'm going to go over some of the logistics of how this works.
Sure.
So, can you all hear me? I'm usually pretty loud. In your folders, you each got a group number. At the bottom of the page of your group, it tells you which order of the stations that you're going to go to. So you're going to be at each station for 30 minutes with a Zoll representative, a Rialto representative. They're going to go through each station with you. You're going to get hands-on opportunities to work with the equipment. At 20 minutes, I'll let you know that there's 10 minutes left. When we wrap up that station, you move to the next station down on your group number.
It's
Does
probably
anybody
going to be
have
shorter
questions?
than 30 minutes.
Yeah?
So
We're
we'll
gonna
let you
run
know.
for 30, if it's, you just
Because
let me know.
most of you will be done at each station in about, the first time at about 12 minutes and the second time about 8 minutes. So if we get an
Alright.
opportunity, we'll run through twice instead of spending time sitting around.
All right, I'll give you a 10-minute warning. All right, any questions about the groups? So up on the front of the stage, 2 CPR stations. Back here
Wait,
to
wait,
the
before you,
left.
before you
You're
run
going
your
to sit
group-
down for a while more. She's
Yeah,
just
we're
giving
gonna,
you
we're gonna
overview.
demonstrate it first, and then
Oh,
we're gonna,
okay.
yeah.
You're gonna go around the station then.
We're gonna show you in a really slow fashion exactly how each step goes. So,
Can you put that?
you can
with,
understand it, you can see it, and you
Thank
can
you.
do it. So we're gonna show you once, and then we'll let you get your hands on, and we'll let you mess it up, right? Because that's the process. We watch one, we mess one up, mess a couple of them up, figure out how to get it done.
Some of the folks in the room, BLS providers, EMTs, not paramedics, not docs. Everything we talked about can be done by BLS providers. We've worked with BLS providers that they have no paramedics at all, and they're going to save more lives than we are because they're not going to make the mistake of stopping doing something important to do something less important, right? They can do iGels, they can do rescue pod, they can do auto pulse, they can do heads up CPR, they can do good feedback, high quality CPR. They can do everything that's important that we know of today to change the world and outcomes. So just something to think about there. So I am in Joe's setup up here. We're gonna crawl, walk, run. We probably won't run today, but we're just gonna kind of walk through the basics of everything. We're gonna demonstrate. This is the first 2 minutes scenario. So it's literally you walk in the door on a dead person, and by far this is the most important skill that we are the worst at. Do that one.
I'm sorry. Chief, do you want to talk about 4 simple pauses real quick? I don't think we covered it.
We did yesterday, right?
Did we? Okay.
So we have 4 defined pauses of CPR in our system. 2 of them come here in the first 2 minutes. 2 more of them come when we put the auto pulse on, and then there's no more pauses. The first pause is for a feedback device. So you have to lift up your hands for less than a second to put the feedback device and go down. The second one is for posterior defibrillation pad. So you got to pause CPR to lift them up, put that pad on. A pause to place the mechanical CPR device, and that's a very brief pause, and you'll see that. And then a pause to start the mechanical CPR device. After that, after the first 4 minutes of the arrest, you never stop again in our system. So 2 of the pauses come here. That's our wheel of survival. It's in your deal or in your folder. So in this scenario, there's 2 people. This is assumption that an engine or an ambulance got there first, and then the help would come later. It's really an opportunity to see how difficult it is to do high quality CPR. And I'm the first person in the door, and Jeremiah's the second person in the door. And all we're going to do is high quality CPR with an ITD and capnography in the airway circuit, as well as attach the puck for high quality CPR and the defibrillation pads. That's it. That's all we're doing in the station. And you guys will all get to do it and get to see kind of the discrete pieces of it and how hard it is to do high quality CPR, even if you're looking at a screen that's giving you feedback. Because how many of you are doing that today? Looking at a screen that's giving you feedback. And how many of you are not? So for those that are, good for you. For those that aren't, tell me how, be intellectually honest, tell us how hard it is to actually do it, even when you're looking at the screen and can do it. So Joe's gonna read off the screen the steps, and we're gonna follow them just so you can see what the steps are.
So we had to define the first 2 minutes because we were really poor at it. So we had so much focus on the auto pulse that the first 2 minutes of cardiac arrest in our system initially was just like, we weren't doing it. So we had to really define the first 2 minutes, and that's sort of how we got here. That's part of the process. So, okay. So the first 2 people come in the door. The first person is a compression person, right? And so he's gonna come in and start compressions. Next slide.
So a couple key points on this one. Compression range, obviously 110 to 120, 2 to 2.4. Can you measure 2.4 inches on a person or on a mannequin? Probably not. So that's why you have to have feedback. Full recoil, we say full recoil, it cannot be observed by the person doing CPR. We believe that to be true. If you know a way to do it, awesome, but nobody's good at it. But we use this puck. This is what tells us the quality of CPR. See the red hash mark on it. I should be able to stand across the room and see some part of that red line, not the whole thing, but some part of that red line on the release of every compression. That lets me know that a little bit of your hand's coming off and you're not leaving any weight on the chest. Some people say you should be able to slide a credit card underneath there. I don't think that's observable from the other side of the room unless you want to have a 6th person on your arrest that's going to just slide that credit card underneath there every time. If that's the case, I suggest you get Venmo so you can charge them for that. But if not, that's kind of the mechanism we use. Somebody else is observing for full recoil. Go ahead, Joe, next one. We're 30-2, like we said in previously. Go ahead. Go ahead. Now the part that he likes the most, he gets to tell me what to do.
All right, so obviously we walk in, scene safe, right?
Scene safe, universal precaution. No, the real, regular stuff.
Assess the patient, make sure they're in cardiac arrest.
Do I really need to assess them? Does everyone know when somebody's dead? Unconscious, not breathing? Okay. Now what do I do?
So initiate manual compressions.
Okay.
All right. So the second person comes in, right, comes with them, turns on the monitor.
You should turn on the monitor when you take it out of your fire engine or your ambulance and activate the end-tidal CO2 function so that it's warmed up and calibrated by the time you bring it over to me.
So this seems relatively simplistic, that the monitor's got to be facing the guy that's going to look at it for feedback. It remarkably happens a lot of the time where the monitors, we bring the monitor in and do this, right? All right. So this guy can see it, and that guy that needs the feedback can't see it, right? And he's not going to say anything, neither is anybody else, so this is just part of our process. The monitor always goes right in front, and he's looking directly at the monitor for feedback. So, coordinate placement of the puck.
This is the first of 2 pauses here.
First acceptable pause, right? Puck goes in, right back down. How long was that?
Most patients don't have Velcro on them, but if they do, that's cool.
Couple of seconds. We're going to place the anterior pad.
We're not really going to place it.
You don't need to stick it.
I'm going to say that we're going to put it hand there so you see the timing of things.
So we place that anterior pad, right? And then he places oximetry on.
So in our system, we put him on pulse ox and blood pressure at this point. This guy doesn't have an arm, so we'll defer to that on this.
So now we're going to put the second pad on. Remember AMP, right? So we're going to set him up, put the second pad on.
3.
So now both pads are on. Lower the patient. Back with compressions. So the airway guy is going to now assemble the mask. Mask, ITD, end-tidal CO2, and the BVM.
By the way, I'm doing perfect. Unless we turn it around to you, then I'm not doing perfect.
I'm going to talk slower as you have to do it for a longer period of time.
123, a full diamond, full release.
So
not true.
Notice how we put that together. Obviously, the end-tidal CO2 is above the rescue pod, so it helps keep crap out of it. And then Jeremiah holds a 2-handed seal during compressions.
28,
so the rescue pod works without the seal.
30.
It doesn't work. Delivers ventilations. One hand, right? That's the first 2 minutes. Questions about the first 2 minutes, how that looks?
Or why anybody watching my hands? No? Who was our observer for recoil? That was horrible recoil. That was almost exactly what we do in real life, though. So I was going too fast, not deep enough, and no recoil. So that is not what to do. But when you look at it, you can be intellectually honest and go, oh, my rate's too fast and I'm too shallow. And so the screen doesn't lie. It is recording. So, do it for yourself.
So 2-handed seal during the compressions, 1-handed seal during the ventilation. Right, so it's almost backwards from the way we normally do it, right? To make the rescue pod do what we want it to do. We're not all that concerned with moving that much air initially, right? Because how do we move air? We do this, right? Every fireman in the world.
Roll it to get the rest of it out.
Get the rest of it out, yeah. So we're moving enough air in that process. That's what the first 2 minutes look like, and they're very important that we get those first 2 minutes right.
Station 2.
All right, so you can turn around when you're over here. So this is kind of continuation. This is the next step. This is initiating the auto pulse.
So imagine that person is now this person. We have teleportation apparently. So we've already done that first 2 minutes. We're not going to put the heart monitor on and everything here because then you got wires and a lot of stuff. We're just, talking about things. But in this case, right, I'm still the same guy. Jeremiah was still the same guy. He's at the head of the patient doing the airway, and I'm off to the side doing compressions. And once again, Joe's going to fast forward through a couple of slides. There's going to be, in addition to me and Jeremiah, there's going to be 3 more people, which is Joe and who else? Joe and you two. She's the person that was doing CPR on Terry in that video, so she saved him. Next one, Joe. There's 2 more pauses here, and the pause is to lift the patient up, to put them on the auto pulse, and then the sizing of the band. Despite the fact that it may take us 15 seconds to 2 minutes maybe to put this auto pulse on, depending on circumstances, the pauses and compressions should never be more than 3 to 4 seconds, 5 seconds max, but we don't see that. And the key there is, again, social engineering is, I'm doing compressions right here, but once we put the person back down, somebody else is going to take over compressions. It's going to be the person at a right-hand angle from their shoulder, because I have access to the bands and the buttons, so I'm going to want to do something with those bands and the buttons. The person up there doesn't have access to them, so we let them take over compressions while I mess with the bands and the buttons, and if it takes me 2 minutes to mess with the bands and the buttons, CPR is still going on. So,
all right, so step 1 is we got to turn the auto pulse on. So we're doing compressions, right? We're ventilating for the patient.
Again,
So
turn
this is
it
a
on
continuation.
when you're taking out the engine of the ambulance.
Open the band.
I'm the compressor. I'm just going to put my hands on their chest.
And place the
Jeremiah's
band
bagging them.
perpendicular to the board, right? So that you don't get those bands
Sure.
twisted when you're sliding the board underneath them. But just an auto pulse at the patient's head. So this process, by the way, doesn't have to be done quickly. You're not worried about how fast can I get the auto pulse on. You're worried about minimizing interruptions. So getting the auto pulse set up right is way more important than getting it set up fast.
What is Brooke doing right here? Cutting off the shirt. How many of your cardiac arrest victims are naked? Some of them, I'm sure, on toilets or in bed, but not many of them. The shirt coming off is really important. So we wouldn't advocate for limiting compressions to start with. We'd just slide it up and do compressions, get everything on. But at this point, it needs to come off in order to go on the auto pulse, because otherwise it'll get caught up in the bands or can block the vent. So we say cut it and huck it. So, and I really do mean that. Unless there's a fan overhead, don't throw it up there, because then it comes right back down on you. We've done that, unfortunately. So, Joe, tell me what to do.
Okay, so the airway person's going to move the patient's right side out of the way of the auto pulse deployment.
So that's Jeremiah. He comes over to be along with me.
So we're going to straddle the patient's legs, that's me, and grab both wrists. Or that
You're up top, bro. So then so we just switched who was going to do what, which is fine, but that means Joe has to go up and be the person helping with the auto pulse, and ultimately the one that takes over compressions, because that's the position he's in. No problem. I'm still doing compressions. Jeremiah would still be bagging them until we say that we're ready.
Ready.
Board's ready.
Right.
And so we would say we're ready on 3. 1, 2, 3. I stop compressions. She lifts up the arms. We come up. We come down. Joe takes over compressions from that angle right there. And then now, whoever wants to can mess around with these bands as long as they want. Line it up, do the Velcro, undo the Velcro. Compressions are still going on. It's like a 1 second, 2 second pause. There's a last pause here though, because when we say we're ready, and Joe will let us know when he's ready, because he'll just take his hands off. We set the band down, we don't touch it. Go ahead, push the button. We push the button, it sizes, we push it again, it starts. You cannot touch it while it's sizing, because it could interrupt it and it could cause it to fail. That wouldn't be the board failing, that'd be us failing to use the board correctly. And materially, now compressions never stop. Joe, what else do we have left to do with this?
So how long were we off the chest there? 5 seconds? Maybe 7 seconds, right? So we got to make sure we get rid of this shirt. If it's caught up in the band.
Do you see how it is in the band right now? Could that be a problem over time? So when I said huck it, I really did mean it. Because that could be a problem for you later.
So anybody ever heard anybody say the auto pulse fails all the time, it stops, right? So we fixed 99% of those problems because they were all our problems. One of them was,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Couple steps left here, though.
Okay, sorry.
This harness is incredibly important. Where do you think ours were? We owned Autopulse since 2009. Where do you think our harnesses were? In the landfill somewhere. Yeah. So it's very important that those that be on and place, and that it be it holds the person's body to the board. The band doesn't, because when it comes, it has full recoil at the end, so the band's not holding to the bar. And remember, we're going to lift them up and go heads up here in a little bit, so that band can slide. So that's got to be in place.
So let's extend the carry case.
And then this thing goes all the way down to their legs. They got a seat belt. I got it under the arm. So the seat belt, the one thing with this is, remember we talked about intracranial pressure? So not across the gut, across the hips, okay? So, and then this last thing is, there's a couple different colors here.
Yellow.
It should say use this one, dummy, but it doesn't. But so you grab the yellow one. And now they're ready to get picked up. That's the end of this station. But they could stay here forever until you had a gurney ready to go. And that'd be the last station, would be gurney ready to go. So you can pick them up, carry them anywhere you want to go. That's station 2, Autopulse deployment. So even in slow time, reading the slides, all that kind of stuff, the pauses are minimal. But the key is not letting me, who was doing compressions to start with, try to stop compressions to mess around with the band. Let somebody else do compressions while I mess around with them. Next. All these Autopulses are 30 to 2. You have to push a button twice, actually, to go to continuous. Ours are set to continuous, so you just come on and go on and never turn off.
Okay. Come on over here.
Put them on the floor.
So it's getting the patient from that position onto a gurney and intubated.
So now that we did all that over there, the last part is, if you have gurneys, great. If you don't have gurneys, you can use something else. But it's getting them from the floor. They've had hard, flat surface CPR to the gurney. And we'll go to the gurney in a heads-up position. We'll do it by lifting straight up, gurney wheels underneath them, straight back down, just protect your back. They're gonna go onto the gurney, which is already heads up. And then Jeremiah will do apneic oxygenation, and he'll be the airway guy, so he's gonna intubate. How many of you have video laryngoscopy? How many of you have regular direct visual laryngoscopy? Okay, so did we bring?
We have a glide scope.
We have a glide scope. So we'll use the gyroscope, and we would advocate for a 2-person airway technique in this case. So one person has a gyroscope with the ET tube already loaded in the barrel. The other person is going to keep the head and the anatomy from moving around. It just makes intubation easier. All right. If you were doing direct laryngoscopy, we'd say 3 people, because once this person does this, they should keep their eye on the prize and never look away. Because what happens 1 out of 10 times when you look away to grab your tube, it's gone. So you just do this. Somebody else hands you the tube. So it seems stupid, 3 people for an airway. It increases first intubation attempt success rate by a lot, just by not going, I lost it. Unless you just document that that wasn't an attempt, then it doesn't affect it at all.
So we tried to do this by bringing the patient over the side of the gurney, by moving the gurney, moving the patient, and this is about the most effective way. So
it's on this guy right here. Oh, the cannula? I don't know. I thought you were looking for the glide scope. So we're going to do an imaginary nasal cannula.
So the way this works, got everybody? So we're going to get the gurney, obviously put it in the heads-up position. We're going to move into the position the patient. We're going to do a forced-person lift. You're going to lift the patient straight up, slide the gurney underneath them. Right, real simply. You guys ready?
You got to help, Joe. And then someone is going to wheel the gurney, the 5th person. We lost Brooke. He's going to wheel the... Sir, can you help us out? We're going to lift straight up, and then you can wheel the gurney underneath. Terry?
Yep, 1, 2.
Yeah, we're gonna do it with it on. All right, lift, 1, 2, 3. Wheeling. Firefighters always walk, but you shouldn't. It's not good for you. So nasal cannula will go on right now, just right here, 15 liters a minute, and now you have an infinite amount of time to intubate this patient. Jeremiah's going to do, he's going to do regular manual CPR. You all use silicone spray lube on your patients. Yeah, no, this is a brand new mannequin. So in this technique, he's going to be the third airway guy handing him the stuff. I'm going to stabilize their head. Some patients, I imagine you've all had patients that have kyphosis, right? So their head does this with every compression, right? So that makes it a little bit harder to intubate. Well, we don't like to hold it down or do anything else, but we would just 2 hands on their jaw, just keep it from moving. Nothing on their neck or anything like that.
So where's the cardiac monitor go? It doesn't go here on the stomach, right? It goes down here on the legs. Basically, the guy that's intubating, so he can keep an eye on what's going on, and the other guys up there that are taking care of the airway are watching the numbers. This guy's real stiff, or lady, sorry.
So you all get to play with this mannequin. It literally came out of the box yesterday, so it's either that or Jeremiah's really bad at his job, which is always possible.
It's possible.
A thing to help with the head bouncing around, just put a pillow behind their head. It makes you feel more comfortable that their head's not doing this. It doesn't actually do anything, but it makes you feel more comfortable. And we'll show you a couple things about airway in a second. So the ET2 puller will go on, and where does it go? Across the ears, back of the head. So if you forget everything else we said, maybe take that home with you tonight, because it's, can you imagine? I mean, think about it, it's not very good. What would be worse than that? Putting a C-collar on them. Anybody ever do that for intubated patients? That is by far the worst. So, yes, sir?
You put that, which way you orient it,
Either way.
doesn't matter if it's upward or down.
Yeah, but they have a manufacturer's recommendation and we never read it, so it actually is supposed to be the hole to the bottom.
So we would now drop an NG tube. After we do the NG tube, we can establish venous access. And then we can maybe give Abby. Maybe.
So I'm gonna turn this off for a second. Can you pause it? So just things to think about. We have 2 trains of thought, or 2 medics. All of our medics like to intubate in the heads up position, and it's one of 2 ways. It's either they like to spread their legs, put their arms on the board and do this, and align their visual acuity with the neck, or up, stop, and then intubate. That's it, right? So it's the same principle, but it's just whether you want to. But never do you lay on a puddle of puke or kneel in a puddle of puke or do any of those things. It's just right here. In general terms, you guys, airway assessment, 1, 2, 3, 4, familiar with what I'm saying? Yes? No? You just intubate everybody the same? Cool. A 1, you could do a jaw thrust and see airway anatomy, right? Tip of the vallecula, something like that. A 2, you could see something, but not much. A 3 or 4, you're not going to see anything with a jaw thrust. 1 or 2, just intubate them. If you put your hands on their jaw and it feels like mine, it's going to be a 3 or a 4. We would say, get out of bougie, prepare for a difficult intubation. But you have however long you need, right? Apneic oxygenation, pulse oximetry, blood pressure, auto pulse is going, everything's fine. So try this today and see what you think. Those are the 3 scenarios that we're going to run through. We'll try to make them, they'll go as long as they need to get you rotating through. There's 2 of each one, and then we'll talk about it a little bit, and then we'll get you back into them, and you can do them again. So it's just about, can you do good high-quality CPR with feedback? Yes or no? Can you get them on the auto pulse with limited delays? And the answer should be yes. And do you like intubating in the heads-up position? Then can you make this transition with apneic oxygenation pretty easily just with my crappy explanation of it. And hopefully the answer is yes, but if it's no, that's okay. My name's Joe. You all know what groups you're in? You looked in your thing?
Was Amy sending them to a specific place?
So there's 2 CPRs, there's 2 auto pulses, and there's 2 airways. And I'm gonna turn this off.
Chief, when you guys intubate, you don't tap on that.
We'll put a pillow here sometimes. But